All right, everyone. I think we're going to get started here. So, hey, everyone. Thank you for coming to the 10th Daily Gwei AMA series. As you all know, by now I do these every 2 weeks. Thanks to Coffee for setting up the calendar invite for this once again. The way this AMA works is that if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. You can see the button down the bottom of your Discord screen there. Otherwise, I'll just be reading through the questions that were asked in the AMA series channel. If you don't want to ask your question on stage, you can ask it in the AMA series channel, and I'll answer it at the end once I've gone through the ones that I've already noted down on my list here. And obviously this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube within 24 hours with timestamps as well. So if you have to leave early or you come late or anything like that, you can check it out on YouTube. So without further ado, let's get started with the first question from the AMA series channel that comes from Amit23, who asks, how do you determine if the project, team, app, incentive, community has a positive sum mission, and what are some positive sum projects that you are seeing in the Ethereum ecosystem? As someone who's still learning to evaluate projects, listening to the refill is a great starting point to begin my own research, but I still don't have a good system in place to identify great projects. So it's quite hard to identify great projects, especially during bull markets, because what ends up happening is that you'll have a lot of projects that go live, and a lot of the time they'll have a token. And then because it's a bull market, or maybe the project does kind of like some liquidity mining, what will end up happening is this project will look like it's doing really well because they'll get a lot of liquidity in, they'll have like a lot of total value locked, and you'll see people talking about it and whatever. But a lot of the time, it's usually just because people have bought the token and they're thinking, oh, well, I'm speculating on this. I'm just going to talk about it on Twitter so I can pump the token price up. And if there's liquidity mining incentives in place for this project, well, then the higher the token price goes, the more kind of, I guess, like APY you can earn from these liquidity incentives, the more total value locked, and then it makes the project look good. But it works the other way as well. When the token price comes down, liquidity leaves, and then you can kind of have a death spiral from there. So it's definitely hard. So don't kind of like feel down or anything about not being able to identify something, I guess, just from the surface level stuff. You definitely have to dive deeper into various projects. I think it's also like on a risk curve. If you kind of get involved with a project and on day one, well, then the risk is much greater than getting involved with a project on like day 365, right? For example, because you'll have a lot more data to work off. From day one, all you've got is, okay, well, you maybe spoke to the team briefly and they seem cool, and maybe you looked at the idea or their white paper, whatever they have, and you think to yourself, oh, okay, this looks cool, maybe this can work, and kind of you get involved from there, but it's still extremely risky because it's day one. You don't know what's going to happen from there. But then on day 365 of the project, you'll have a whole year, which is a lot of time in crypto, especially worth of data to look at and say, okay, well, this team's legit. They're building. They've still got traction despite not maybe they don't even have liquidity incentives or anything like that. And then you kind of like get involved from there. It's not a binary thing. It doesn't have to be like day one or day 365, but the longer that a project has been around for, usually the kind of like, I guess, more credible it is, and the easier it is to determine kind of the things you mentioned, like, how good the team is, how good the actual idea is there actually a product market fit here? Are they still just paying out huge liquidity mining rewards, or have they actually got organic traction? What's their community like? Is it just full of people who are in it for the token? Or do people actually care about the project and actually care about growing the thing? So yeah, that's obviously a lot easier to do a year in than it is on day one. So that you just have to kind of like decide, what your risk profile is. Do you want to invest in a project, both your time and money on day one? Do you want to take that massive risk for potential massive upside? Or do you want to get kind of like involved in a project that's been around for a while? And if you look at, there's a lot of the top projects out there. They've been around for quite a while now. I mean, Bitcoin obviously has been around for a very long time now. Ethereum since 2015. And you make your way down the list on CoinMarketCap, and not even just like the layer ones, just all the different projects, like DeFi projects, for example. One of the top DeFi projects, Maker, it may seem boring from the outside, but they're a top DeFi project for a reason. They have their shit together, right? They have a really great team. They have a really great DAO structure. They have a product that people like. It's got product market fit. Same with other ones like Arvan, Compound, and Uniswap as well, obviously is a fan favorite. I think pretty much everyone has used Uniswap at least once in their life at this point. SushiSwap is probably, a really good example of something that if you had bet on it from day one and you kind of like bought into the mania, you would have been down on your investment for quite a while. And it was actually super risky because I think that without the leadership of Mackie, who actually took over from Chef Nomi originally, who has now stepped down, as some of you will know, I think without his leadership, SushiSwap would have probably died off, and it wouldn't have actually gone as far as it's gone. So that's the kind of risk you play at the end of the day. If you had bought sushi once the kind of like hype died off, I think it was trading at maybe 60 or 70 cents, and then it ended up trading at like $15 or $20 at the top there, and I think right now it's at about $12. Well, you would have made like a decent amount of money there from doing that, but obviously the risk was much higher than buying something else, whether that be kind of like ETH or some other kind of project out there. So yeah, there's a money side to it, but then there's also the kind of like social side to it. Like, do you want to invest your time into a project that is inevitably going to fail? Well, obviously you don't, but that's going to happen from time to time. I remember personally back in, I guess, like 2017, 2018, when Plasma was all the rage about layer 2 scaling. I invested a lot of time in keeping up with different kind of like Plasma projects, reading all the research on it, kind of getting to know what was going on in that ecosystem. And I don't really look back on it as a waste of time. I think Plasma definitely is not a technology that is going to be used kind of at scale going forward. I think it was, rollups are like a spiritual successor to Plasma. We took the kind of learnings from Plasma and applied them to rollups, but I think with technology it always evolves over time, so you can't kind of get caught in that mindset of, oh, I wasted all this time learning about this technology when these new ones come out and kind of replaced it. I mean, there's new technology that replaces everything all the time. You just have to kind of adjust your mental model when you have to learn something new, and that's just the way it is, right? And some people don't want to learn something new. They want to be stuck in their old ways, and we see this all the time. I mean, there's always the jokes about the boomers who don't want to learn anything new. They just want to stick in their kind of like what they're used to, and that's totally fine. But by doing that doesn't make a good investor. That doesn't make someone who kind of like is a free thinker and can actually kind of like think critically about different projects within the ecosystem and kind of like make calculated bets on them, whether that be with your time or your money. So hopefully that kind of like answers your question and gives you a lot of context around kind of like how to evaluate different projects. I mean, if I was to dive a little bit deeper on kind of like what I look for personally in projects, I definitely weight the team as the kind of like biggest thing, because even if the product that they're building doesn't have product market fit, if the team are really good builders, if the team is cohesive, if the team actually cares about building something cool, then they can always pivot and build something different, or maybe build something new as part of like their suite of products. So I always look at the team first. And then of course I'll look at the products that they're building. Like, does this actually make sense? Does it have product market fit? Will it scale? Will people actually kind of use this thing? Will it actually work? All that sort of stuff. And then, I go down the list from there. After those two things, it's really a toss-up between kind of like, okay, what does the community look like? I think community is pretty critical, but I would say that the core team and the product idea has to be good, or else the community is just not going to come. And then from there, you got a bunch of other things you could look at, like, what are the liquidity mining incentives like? Do they lend themselves to parasites coming along and just mining, the incentives, dumping them, and then the token price kind of trends down over time, which destroys the community. I've seen this happen plenty of times. And then, you have a bunch of other things down the list that you can kind of look at as well. So hopefully that kind of like answers your question and gives you a bunch of context around that. All right, the next one comes from Sodium Star here, who says, "Hey Anthony, after yesterday's refuel," so this was the refuel I think on the 8th of September, "I thought your position on privacy in crypto seems a bit schizophrenic. On the one hand, you are laughing at politicians when they are worried about anonymity in crypto, but on the other hand, you are super bullish on ZK tech, or zero knowledge tech, with private transactions being one of the applications, such as Aztec, Railgun, etc. How do you reconcile this? In that sense, isn't crypto an actual threat to all current nation states that, e.g., rely on fair taxation?" So the way I kind of look at privacy within crypto is a bit kind of like nuanced here. You can have privacy at different layers. Layer 1 privacy, there's blockchains that focus on this, such as Zcash, which has shielded addresses, or you have Monero that has like privacy by default, so pretty much every transaction is private on there. That's not what Ethereum is going for. Ethereum, I don't think, will have privacy built into the protocol itself. And there's a few reasons for this. The major reason is that when you do this, you introduce kind of like a bit of a scary situation where if there was a bug that happened, especially like inflation bugs, where just say for some reason there was a massive bug where someone could mint like 100 million ETH to themselves. Well, you wouldn't actually know that happened because of the privacy features within the protocol. If this happened on Monero, you wouldn't actually know until that kind of like money, I guess, like flowed into an exchange, or you kind of like we're able to do some maybe on-chain analysis or anything on stuff like that. But the way Monero is built is that it's extremely hard to kind of tell, if not impossible, to tell what's going on there. So that's why I think like privacy on layer one in protocol is not going to happen. But with Ethereum, you have the benefit of smart contracts where you can definitely do things like Aztec's shown this off, where you can basically use zero knowledge tech to build privacy into layer one smart contracts. But again, it's not private in the sense that it's kind of like totally shielded. You can still audit it. You can still see, okay, well, according to the cryptography here, this actually still plays by the rules. This actually still makes sense. And this, this is actually correct. So it's not like you can fake anything, right? But then kind of like when you think about privacy and kind of like hiding yourself from the government, for example, and stuff like that. I mean, I think about this as the same way as cash. With cash, there's a lot of people who will do cash jobs, or a lot of shops that will be like, that'll take cash and they won't actually report like the total earnings to avoid paying tax. So, I mean, this already happens at scale within the kind of like non-crypto world. So that's how I think about it with crypto. And it's already happening regardless of privacy or not, where people aren't, I guess, like declaring the amount of money they've made. They're not declaring taxable events. They're not paying the tax that they should pay. And with privacy, obviously, it's going to be much harder for, I guess, these kind of like maybe on-chain analysis tools or governments to kind of look at the chain and be like, okay, well, this is what you owe, this is what you owe. So they're always going to rely on the centralized exchanges. So if you ever want to cash out to fiat, well, it's going to be very hard to do that if you're not paying taxes, because everything is logged on a centralized exchange and is kept for a long time. And if you are audited or kind of like if the exchange is audited, all that information goes to the relevant tax authorities, and then they can find discrepancies in that. They can basically say, well, you put like $10,000 in and you took $20,000 out. Where did this extra $10,000 come from, and why didn't you declare it on your tax return, sort of thing? So there are different kind of like ways that can work out there, and a lot of it is also enforcement via, I guess, like, enforcement of the law via threat of enforcement, where they're basically saying, well, if you willfully dodge your tax obligations, then you can either be subject to massive fines or you can be put in jail. And that's how a lot of the laws work, right? Where there's just kind of like the threat of enforcement that works to basically keep people in check, even though it's very hard to police everything at the end of the day. So hopefully that kind of like gives a bit of extra color around how I think about privacy. I think that just generally privacy is a fundamental human right. It shouldn't be something that we should be saying, oh, well, we shouldn't have it because governments won't be able to track us. I mean, or won't be able to see like things like people's kind of like tax records or stuff like that. I think that's kind of like a bit of it's kind of like a bit of a slippery slope to go down, because then, you start kind of saying, well, I mean, if the government can access everything that I'm doing on chain, well, that's okay. It's whatever. They only want to know about it for tax reasons. Well, I mean, as we've seen, I guess like through the political sphere, it's more than that. You can use these on-chain kind of transactions to monitor kind of like political dissonance for an example there. Just imagine some country out there who's like, okay, well, we know that our opposition is being funded via crypto, so let's track all the people funding them via crypto and let's label them as political dissonance, and let's kind of like ban them from certain things, and kind of like put a mark on their, not a mark on their head or whatever, but like ban them from government services, or kind of like call them out publicly and stuff like that. It gets really dark really quickly when the more you think about it. So that's why I think that privacy on Ethereum is a fundamental human right. Not just on Ethereum, but just generally is a fundamental human right, and we should still work towards it with the zero knowledge technology. And I think we will. I don't think it's a choice of like, are we going to do it? It's just kind of like when is it going to happen? It's not an if. So hopefully that gives you a bunch of extra clarity around that, Sodium Star. All right, one here from Dom. It's a bit of an off-topic question. Where does the L in Sassel 0x come from? So the funny thing is, I've had the nickname Sassel since I was 12 years old in year 6 in high school. It was just something one of my friends kind of like came up with as a nickname, and it stuck at the end of the day. Obviously, the Sass comes from my surname, but yeah, there's no kind of like L there. So people always ask that, actually. It's a very common question. I don't actually remember why my friends started calling me this. They just did. And it's funny because like my friends in real life will alternate between like Sass and Sassel. It won't really be kind of like one or the other as kind of like a hard rule, but yeah, it just stuck over the years and it kind of became my on-chain identifier. Obviously the 0x is a homage to the fact that every Ethereum address starts with 0x as kind of like the prefix there. So yeah, hopefully that answers that for you, Dom. All right, on to one from Monkey King, who asks, what does the future of ENS domains look like for you? Is it a good investment like how people invested in .coms in the 80s? Will .eths be the .coms of the future? I was investing in ENS domains that I assume could be the future crypto metaverse companies, and curious if I'm wasting my time and ETH. So I don't know if you'd seen this, Monkey King, or not, but a few weeks ago, ENS actually integrated normal DNS kind of like names like .com and whatever into their app, into like as a feature within their system, where essentially you could tie your Ethereum address to a .com. So if you own apple.com, you can do, without having, if you own apple.com, you don't have to own apple.eth. You can tie your Ethereum address to apple.com, and people can use apple.com as a normal ENS name, just like they would apple.eth, for example. So from that point of view, I don't think it would be a good investment, because I don't see companies going out there and prioritizing buying a ENS name just with .eth on it, instead of just using their already kind of like own .com. Like, I don't see Google being like, oh, well, I'm going to spend millions of dollars, they're not going to spend millions of dollars, which obviously is a rounding error to them. But I just feel like, maybe Google's not the right example. Maybe they would do it. But I feel like on kind of like the most kind of like businesses sides of things, or the most people's sides of things, they're probably not going to go through the hassle of spending money just to get the .eth. They're just going to stick with what they already have. Plus, it simplifies things as well. If Google can just say, oh, well, we have an Ethereum address and it's tied to google.com, that's much easier than trying to, I guess, like say, oh, it's google.eth. And then all the people who have no idea what .eth actually is will be like, they'll have to go learn about it, or they'll just kind of like not resonate with it at all. So, yeah, I mean, obviously this is an investment advice, but I personally aren't investing in ENS names, because I knew about this for quite a while, that they were implementing this feature, and I knew that it would be, and, because they had publicly spoken about this for years, and I knew that would kill kind of like any speculative value on these sorts of things. But I do think the future of ENS is very bright. I think it's obviously a much needed kind of like service within crypto. I'm actually a little bit surprised that it hasn't taken off, as much as I thought it would at this point. I thought people would be using ENS names more regularly to kind of like send stuff to people. Whenever I ask people for an address, I hope they give me an ENS, and obviously not everyone has an ENS on their address, but if they do, sometimes they'll just send me the full address. They won't actually send me their ENS name, and I'll be like, oh, that was weird. Like, what was the point of that? So I always try to make a point of kind of sending sassel.eth to people as my ENS name instead of the address. And if you want to double check it, you can always do so on Etherscan. But I think it's just much easier doing that than kind of like having to go copy paste my address in and whatever. And it's just like much easier for me to type out. So yeah, I think the future is very bright there, but I personally am not speculating on ENS domains because of the fact that you can tie your Ethereum address to any kind of TLD, whether that be .com or .io or whatever else is out there at the end of the day. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. All right, so one here from Yon the Fawn, who asks, or two here actually. The first question is, if gas fees serve as an economic disincentive for spamming the network, how are L2s able to combat spam given their low fees? So this is funny because the L2s still have fees, as we've all probably experienced by now, and depending on what kind of like, I guess, spam attack you want to do, it will kind of like be a different cost. Like if you want to keep continuously spamming the network, then the cost is going to be very, very high, because even at like very cheap fees, say like 1 cent, it depends on how many transactions you're sending, but even at kind of like 1 cent fees, that adds up really, really quickly, right? Like if you do 100 transactions, it's $1, and then it kind of grows exponentially from there. But as we all know, a lot of these L2s don't offer like 1 cent fees just yet. I mean, the ones that do and the ones that will in the future, such as like, I guess, like the Validiums and Volitions of the world, will have different ways to deal with spam as well. There's kind of like quality of service things you can put in place that essentially you can actually. So this is a fun fact about L2s and even L1s, but like L2s, because this is in the context of Ethereum, you can actually input kind of like, I guess, measures to identify spam transactions and kind of like filter them out of the network, or at least tag them as low priority transactions. And it's fairly trivial to do this as well, because spam is really easy to identify at the end of the day. Spam transactions usually take the form of kind of like quick succession transactions doing very similar things, and you can kind of drop them. I don't know kind of like what that's going to look like. I don't know if any of the L2s have that right now, but I think it's kind of like trivial to kind of tell what is spam and what isn't. But then you kind of like fall into a little bit of a, I guess, like controversial area where you're basically like, well, is the network deciding which transactions they want to accept or not? And the funny thing is that like miners and stakers and then L2 kind of like sequencers will already have the ability, to do this. They can drop any transaction that they want. If they see spam hitting the network, they can decide not to include it in a block. The miners can kind of like, this is why we call these networks censorship resistant and not censorship proof, because the miners, stakers, sequencers, whatever you want to call them, whatever block producer it is, can definitely censor the transactions as they see fit here. The reason that they don't is because a lot of the time, is because of the fees, of course, and a lot of the time, it just doesn't make sense from a game theory point of view for them to be censoring transactions. But if it's pure spam, well, then no one's going to complain that pure spam is being kind of filtered through. But I don't think there's been any large scale kind of like example of that happening just yet. But yeah, I mean, like that's another way of disincentivizing spam on the network. But generally, fees are a good way to do it. And then you also have kind of like, I guess, the hard limits in place for blocks, for example. The gas limit is what we call it in Ethereum. That kind of puts an upper bound on how many transactions can happen and stuff like that. And it's funny because there was actually a bug that happened during end of 2016 called the Shanghai DOS attacks, which you should read up on, where the network was basically slowed to a crawl for about a month because there was a lot of spam transactions kind of like in the backlog that kind of bloated the state and had to be filtered through. So there has been examples of this happening before. And yeah, it's definitely fees are an easy way to kind of like, I guess, not fix it, but like mitigate the issue. But as you mentioned, with L2s that have really, really low fees, they're going to have to employ other methods, because there's some L2s out there that will offer free transactions, because they'll be like a Validium or a Volition where they'll store the data off chain and they'll just kind of like put other things on chain, like the proof, put the proof on chains, for example. And in that world, and if they're offering kind of like free transactions, well, then they'll probably do some kind of like quality of service themselves, where they filter out transactions based on identifying them as spam or not. So there's definitely trade-offs here, but hopefully that answers your first question. The second question you had was, could you explain why the concept such as enterprise blockchains exist? Blockchains seem to only add value over a database with multi-party access if your system needs to be decentralized. For enterprise use cases such as intercommunication between a handful of banks, it doesn't seem to meet that criteria. So I think a lot of the enterprise blockchain space is really just these R&D departments being like, hey, like we saw this new technology, we want to do some R&D here. Can you give us funding? Because obviously within a big corporation, there's business units, and each business unit will get funding depending on kind of like they have to justify their funding, right? To kind of, I guess, like the treasury of the company. So, what better way to justify new research and development funding than bringing up fancy words like blockchain, AI, and machine learning at the end of the day? That's maybe a more cynical take on it, but I think that applies to most of it. But that's not to say that these things don't have value. I think the value of doing the R&D on kind of like the quote-unquote enterprise blockchains is getting to mainnet eventually. Now, we saw this recently. There was the EY Nightfall project, which has been around for a while now. A few years now, has gone through many iterations, and that was pretty much a private blockchain project or enterprise blockchain project that kind of like didn't hit mainnet, or it hit mainnet in like limited capacities. But now it's gotten to the point where they're now working with Polygon, and they want to bring this to mainnet Ethereum as a roll-up instead of keeping it closed off within the enterprise kind of ecosystem of whatever company it is, whether that be EY or something else. So from that point of view, the R&D that they did was worth it, because now we're going to get like one of these, we're going to get another roll-up where it's going to be fully private. It's going to be like a hybrid between ZK roll-up and an optimistic roll-up, and Polygon's going to lead the charge there as well, which I think is really cool too. So yeah, I think a lot of the time it's just like buzzwordy, get funding for new ideas to kind of like research. But at the end of the day, the ones that do succeed in bringing their kind of like enterprise blockchains to market will be the ones that use mainnet and leverage mainnet. It'll basically be like the intranet and internet, where each kind of like enterprise will have their own intranet. Whoever's ever worked for like a company, like especially a big corporate, that they all have their own intranets that can't be accessed from the internet unless you have special access. Like it's not open to the public internet. You have to go through different kind of like proxies and everything like that to get in. It's going to be the same thing with a lot of these enterprise chains, I believe, where they're going to have these internal kind of intranets that can talk to the Ethereum mainnet, for example, so they can bridge in and out of in a kind of like way where it's not open to the public, but it can still interface with the public chain. Obviously, that being Ethereum. So yeah, hopefully that answers your second question there, Yawn. All right, one here from Matthew T, and this is a big one, so I'm just going to get a drink and I'll continue on. Just give me one sec, guys. All right, so let's get into this one from Matthew T, who asks, would you give us a deep cut on Solana and what you see as the pros and cons of this chain and its long-term potential? It's pretty easy to feel FOMO about it given recent price action, and at least one major ETH bull I trust has tweeted positive remarks about Solana recently. And I think that was the question there. So I've talked about Solana, I think, a little bit on the refuel before. Obviously, I've talked about it on Twitter as well, and there's been a bunch of people talking about it like over the past few weeks because of its price rise. I mean, this question was asked on the 9th of September, which is pretty much the heart of its major rise. But my kind of view on Solana is not one that's totally positive. I actually think that kind of like not thinking about the decentralization trade-offs that Solana has taken, just thinking it from a pure tech perspective, I actually don't believe that Solana can do what they say they're going to be able to do, which is scale to the whole world on layer one without sharding. So for those of you who don't know, Solana's kind of, I guess, narrative and marketing has always been, we think that, all the other chains doing kind of like a layer one, layer two approach, it leads to fragmentation. So we're going to do everything on layer one where we keep everyone on the same kind of layer. Everything's composable. And we're not going to do sharding or anything like that. And we're going to be able to scale to the world. And it's going to be all well and good. And I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, we saw recently, and as I said, this question was asked a couple of weeks ago, but we saw recently with them going offline for 18 hours, that was due to the network being spammed by basically bot transactions, which kind of like not blew up the validators, but kind of like sent them offline because the network couldn't handle the load. And the network couldn't handle the load is because a lot of the validators weren't actually running the required hardware. And even the ones that were, I'm pretty sure there was kind of like either a software bug or there was something that happened where those spam transactions, as I was just talking about before, weren't filtered through, and that ended up kind of like leading to an overload of the network. Now, they claimed that we're able to get 400,000 transactions per second. Well, I mean, it was really 0 transactions per second because those things weren't processed. But if you think about it from in terms of a demand perspective, 400,000 transactions per second, that's bots. That's not real kind of people. That is pretty much all bots. And the network boasts that it's able to do 50,000 transactions per second today, and normally averages around 2,000, but pretty much all of that belongs to validator-related activities. So for those who don't know, the Solana validators have to vote on things, and those votes are counted as transactions on the chain. So if you see that they have like 2,000 TPS, well, that is basically, I think 90% of it belongs, or even more than that, belongs to the validators. So there's that aspect to it. But going back to what I was saying about not being able to scale on layer one, just from a pure technology standpoint, it doesn't work, because if you look at big companies that have already scaled kind of like centralized databases to the world, they all employ various kind of like measures to make sure that they can't be DOSed. Because essentially what happened with Solana was a DOS, a denial of service, where there was just too much activity, transaction activity, and because they say that they can scale to meet that, there was nothing put in place to kind of mitigate that, because their fees are really, really cheap and everything like that. It wasn't a costly thing to do. It wasn't costly to kind of like do all those transactions, and it eventuated from an IDO as well. So everyone was trying to get into these IDO, and bots wanted to kind of like get in and buy these tokens. But with the centralized kind of like databases and stuff like AWS, they all employ different techniques such as load balancing. They employ sharding. They have quality of service kind of like technology that drops different kind of like packets of information if they identify that as being a DOS vector. They have things like Cloudflare that manage that as well. I mean, there's plenty of other techniques. There's a laundry list of them that they go through, and some of these techniques can be used on blockchains. But the problem is that most of those techniques require centralization. They are not things that can be done in a decentralized way. And that's why Ethereum, for example, is not going down that road, because we want to keep the chain as decentralized and secure as possible. But the trade-off is that layer one is expensive because of that. The fees work to basically stop the spam, and the gas limit works to stop the spam at the end of the day, because it's just too expensive to do something like that. And we also keep it easy for anyone to run a node or a full node or anything like that. Whereas on Solana, it's basically very, very, very hard, or you need like kind of really beefy hardware to do so. So that's like from a technical perspective. Now, the reason why I talk about the tech first and want to move into like the decentralization second is because the tech dictates how decentralized this chain can be. So for those of you who don't know, Solana right now has 20 validators, which are basically supernodes sitting in kind of like data centers. They are not validators that you can run on a home PC. It's not like the validator that I have for my that I have sitting behind me in the refuel videos on my little PC that you see for ETH2. These are validators that are extremely beefy hardware. I'm sure some of you have seen the hardware requirements. I mean, the minimum, which I actually think is not enough these days, of RAM is 128 gigabytes. I think you actually need 256 gigabytes now, and then the network throughput that you need is insane. And the only place you can get these kind of like hardware is in a data center. It's probably not economical for you to build this at home. And then on top of that, you need, I think, $700,000 worth of SOL tokens just to become a validator, and that just to turn a profit as a validator, and that's not to become one of the 20 validators. This is that currently have the power to halt the network. That's just to become a validator in general, because right now 20% of the 20 validators on Solana have 33% of the stake, which means they can either censor transactions or halt the network altogether. So they can basically come together and say, okay, well, we're going to halt the network and basically send it offline. No one will be able to do anything. So that to me is like an extreme trade-off to get scale, which isn't really scale, because we've seen it already kind of like fall over. It was an 18-hour outage. Like that is, very, very bad. The only longer outages that I know of, I think there's like IOTA had like a 6-week outage, but I mean, IOTA is like a whole nother thing. I'm not going to get into that. And then there were a few other ones as well. But I mean, Solana's whole boasting was about, being able to scale to the world. And then they say, oh, we're still in beta. It's like, well, I mean, your token's not trading as if you're in beta. And you're not marketing as if you're in beta. You're not kind of like warning users about this, everywhere on kind of like your network and stuff like that. So I think that was a bit of a cop out, but that all kind of like builds on top of the technology there. I just don't think that they can scale to the world at layer one, and then they'll hit back. The Solana people will hit back and say, well, Moore's law dictates that every 2 years the amount of transistors on a kind of like computer chip doubles. Well, I mean, that was true for a while, but it's not true anymore. If you actually look at Moore's law, that has slowed down considerably, and it doesn't show any kind of like signs of speeding back up again. But even still, the amount of demand there is for block space is going to outpace Moore's law, even if it does still kind of like play into effect here, or just like hardware improvements in general, by orders of magnitude. The demand for these networks is pretty much infinite. They are monetary networks. People have a lot of ways to make money on them, a lot of ways to profit on them, and that makes people kind of like FOMO, and then that makes kind of like bots come into the play as well, because everyone wants to get into the latest opportunity. And if you have a network where you boast that you can basically offer really, really cheap fees. Basically, I mean, the fees that they have is what, $0.001 dollars or something like that, something crazy. That lends itself to bots kind of like being like a huge part of the network. And these bots aren't just doing things like arbitrage or MEV or anything like that. They're spamming the network. They're kind of like very parasitic at the end of the day. So, I mean, hopefully that gives you kind of like my general thoughts about Solana. And this is just on the tech and decentralization side. I think there's kind of like a lot of other things to talk about as well, but I don't want to kind of like get into that. There's obviously I don't want to go into detail about it, but like at a high level, there's obviously the poor token distribution, where it's very, very insider heavy, where most of the tokens or a large chunk of the tokens belong to VCs, funds, the team and stuff like that, and a lot of these are stakers as well. So and they're kind of like permanent stakers too, because of the fact that like, why would you sell when you're earning such a high staking yield, which I think is like 7 or 8% on Solana right now. So that's a lot. If you have like millions and millions of tokens, or like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tokens, and you're one of the top validators, well, you're making a lot of money from just staking Solana there. So there's that aspect to it. There's also the kind of like, I guess, like people involved. I mean, they rubbed me the wrong way. It feels very kind of like trader driven, more so than kind of like organics, grassroots, community driven. So that's just a personal kind of thing for me. I don't really care to be involved with that sort of stuff. And I actually think on the tech side of things, Solana is probably going to end up pivoting to doing kind of like this roll up centric roadmap that Ethereum is doing, where they scale via layers, or they do sharding or something like that. And the funny thing is that I think if they do that, well, what's the value proposition from there? Like, I don't actually think there's much of a value proposition left. left because everyone's saying, well, Solana is better than Ethereum. Not everyone, but like the people who are Solana fans are saying, oh, it's going to kill Ethereum. It's better than Ethereum because it can scale, and we have really cheap fees. But the problem is that they're comparing it to Ethereum's layer one. Ethereum layer one was never going to be the where we kind of like scale to the world. Yes, we have sharding coming along, but sharding is going to kind of like enhance layer 2. It's not going to allow layer 1 to scale to the point of Solana. And I've explained this in a recent newsletter I did. But basically, the reason for that is because we want layer 1 Ethereum to be super decentralized, super secure, and we want it to be the settlement layer for all these layer 2s. And the funny thing is that Solana could actually just become a layer 2 on Ethereum. They could be secured by Ethereum, and they could be the execution layer in a layer 2 where they could do everything that they're doing now. They could even keep their token, but they would instead just, they were, instead of their validators kind of like validating the security and the decentralization of the network, they would just be kind of like producing blocks as sequences and then and as validators, of course, but like not in the same sense of a layer 1 validator, and then they would inherit Ethereum security. So I actually think that over the longer term, there's going to be much more kind of like, I guess, competition within the layer 2s than there are of other layer 1s. Because with layer 2s, it's much easier to kind of like tap into, I guess, like Ethereum security and leverage Ethereum security and leverage Ethereum's kind of, I guess, like decentralization and community rather than bootstrap your own layer 1 protocol. I think the layer 1 era is like coming to an end. I think kind of this is the last hurrah for them because Ethereum layer 2 is here. We're scaling. There's a lot of kind of like projects now on there. There's more coming every day, and it's showing the world that, well, you can still have your own token at layer 2. You can still do everything you want to do. You can experiment with whatever tech you want to experiment with. You don't have to use Solidity. You don't have to use the EVM. But like all you have to do is pay for your security on Ethereum. And we've seen kind of like layer 2s like Arbitrum doing that lately, where they're basically batching their transactions to Ethereum. Same with Optimism, of course, and all the other L2s out there. So I think thinking about that from that perspective is a funny thought as well, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of these layer 1s are kind of like pointless, but some of them have good tech, some of them have like innovative tech, but why not just be a layer 2 on Ethereum, get all the benefits of Ethereum's decentralization and security and community without any of the drawbacks of being labeled Ethereum killer or kind of like having to bootstrap your own security. And as I said, these chains can still have their own token. Like that doesn't have to go away. So yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out. But yeah, hopefully, Matt, that gives you kind of like my, I guess, overview of Solana. And this is exactly why I don't pay attention to Solana. And people call me an ETH maxi for this, but Solana does not represent what I want to see in the blockchain world. It is not anywhere near decentralized enough. I actually don't even think it's decentralized at all, if I'm being honest. I think Solana is fully centralized. I think that if it wouldn't even require like a nation state to go after them. I think that if enough of them colluded together, they could do serious damage to the network. We saw with their 18-hour outage how kind of like they basically had a Discord channel where they were kind of all talking to each other and being like, okay, well, this is how we get the network back up. And it's just, I mean, and it was just a crazy thing to watch play out, to be honest, especially after all the hype and everything. So yeah, those are my general thoughts there. And you had another question here on Solana there. And you had another question here, Matt, it was about layer 2s, where you say, if layer 2s will be a scaling solution for the Ethereum ecosystem, are high gas fees a potential obstacle just to move ETH to the layer 2 in the first place? For Ethereums who are well capitalized, this may be negligible or a non-issue, but what about people with limited financial resources? Does that initial gas fee represent a deterrent or even a deal breaker? If Ethereum is going to truly scale to hundreds of millions or billions of people, what are your thoughts about this issue? So there's actually a pretty easy way to get around this issue, especially if you're bridging into layer 2 from a decentralized exchange. You can have pools. So this is what Salah actually does right now, where essentially they'll have like a kind of like smart contract that everyone can pool their funds into. So you'll deposit your funds kind of like into it, and then eventually, and that's much cheaper than depositing your funds directly into kind of like the bridge contract to get into layer 2, because you're just basically doing a simple send. So everyone just like kind of like deposit their funds into the smart contract, and then it'll reach a certain kind of like period of time, or it'll reach a certain threshold where that smart contract will do a bulk deposit into this layer 2, and then you'll get credited the coins on layer 2. So that's, I think, what's going to happen with a lot of these centralized exchanges. I think that's the kind of like play they're going to go for, because they know that layer 1 fees are going to be high for, probably forever at this point. So they're going to like look at that and be like, okay, well, we need to do batch kind of like deposits into these layer twos, and they may just eat the cost for their users at the end of the day. It's just like a cost of doing business. But even if they don't, the cost should be much lower than if this user was to kind of like deposit into layer 2 directly. And even, I was thinking about this the other day as well. I think the funny thing about it is with layer 2s, especially with these bridging solutions, is that you can actually potentially bridge into these layer 2s, not just from Ethereum, but from other chains as well, like these other cheaper chains, like the Polygon POS chain, for example. If you go from use Hop and go from Polygon POS chain to Arbitrum, well, it's not it's a different kind of like it's not technically a bridge. It's more of a kind of like cross chain swap. But if you do that, then it's much cheaper than going from Ethereum to the layer 2. But yes, your trust assumptions are more there because it's not the same thing as like a trustless bridge or anything like that. And it's like a transfer through a decentralized exchange, cross-chain kind of decentralized exchange there. So yeah, there are multiple kind of things you can do here. I would encourage you to check out Salah's solution. As I said, they already have something. They call it a public transportation system for DeFi, or for like, I guess, for Ethereum, which I think is a really cool way to frame it, because it's kind of like, well, you can either choose to drive your own car into the, into work, or you can catch public transport. Driving your own car is obviously much more expensive because you have to maintain the car, petrol costs, parking in the city is really expensive. Whereas catching public transport, you just have like that much lower fee to ride the train, and then you don't have to find parking or whatever. You just get off at the station, and you're all well and good from there. That's exactly what Salah's kind of like solution does. So yeah, hopefully that answers your couple of questions there, Matt. All right, one here from Fran who says, okay, this is another Solana related question. With the current pumping of Solana, there is a lot of media emphasis on TPS and how the main problem in Ethereum is low TPS. But I'm not really convinced on TPS as a suitable metric to judge blockchains. There's a lot of other important things like decentralization, security, etc. But I don't really know how to measure those things or compare between networks. What metrics do you think are useful for judging the long-term potential of a blockchain, and where might I find this info? So I totally agree with you. TPS is a very poor kind of like metric to compare blockchains against, because as I mentioned before about Solana, like they boast this high TPS, but I consider Solana to be totally centralized. So what's the point in having high TPS if your blockchain's centralized at the end of the day, right? It doesn't really make much sense from there. But also, I think at the end of the day, Solana and other layer ones that claim to scale on kind of like, at the base layer are not competing with Ethereum's base layer. They're competing with the Ethereum L2 ecosystem. And this is something that I think a lot of people miss, is that Ethereum L1, maybe originally the original creators of Ethereum back in the early days thought that Ethereum layer 1 was going to be the thing where we scaled. But as kind of like it came into view that layer 2s were the way we were going to do this on Ethereum, a layer 1 has never been the long-term sustainable solution for scaling execution. So, and for scaling to like the world where users can sit there and do all their transactions and stuff like that. And layer 2 is going to be where users do that. And we're already seeing that kind of play out there. But I guess to your question about kind of like how to measure these kind of like things like decentralization, security, or long-term health, sustainability of the network, there's a lot here. And there's actually a really great piece from Balaji that I think he published in 2017 called Quantifying Decentralization. So I suggest giving that a read, but I can give my kind of take on this. So decentralization is, I mean, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I don't think many people actually understand what it means and how many facets come into play here. It's not just the nodes, it's not just the validators, but it is a lot more than that. So I can run through the list off the top of my head. The nodes and validators count for a lot. Like if people don't have the ability to run their own full node on consumer hardware to actually check the rules of the system for themselves, I actually don't consider the chain to be very decentralized. And it's funny because like Bitcoiners talk about this all the time, and they try to fight Ethereum sometimes by saying, oh, no one can run a full node on Ethereum, which is total crap. Like I run full nodes. I know many people who run full nodes. It's very easy to do. And I run it on consumer hardware. So that's just pure FUD, but they're definitely right about the fact that people should need to be able to run their own full node to be able to validate the network and validate the rules for themselves, and to be able to kind of like check if anything is going wrong and kind of like point out any issues with the network as well from a security standpoint. So there's that aspect to it. Then there's the decentralization of the ones that are actually producing the blocks, such as the miners currently and the mining pools, and in the future stakers and staking pools. So there's a metric called the Nakamoto coefficient that basically measures the decentralization decentralization based on, I guess, like entities. So if you have like 3 mining pools that account for more than 51% of the network, well then the logic goes that you have a lower Nakamoto coefficient than one that has like 5 mining pools, for example. I actually don't think this metric is great. I think it lacks a lot of nuance because mining pools do not equal individual kind of like miners. Mining pools are very easy to switch. Like a miner can be mining on one pool, and then if that pool decides to do something dodgy, well, they can just switch their miner to another pool very quickly. It's basically an instant switch. And then with kind of like staking, you have an even bigger disincentive within staking pools in that you don't want to stake with someone who you don't consider to be trustworthy if it's a centralized kind of like solution, because you get slashed. We've got like inbuilt slashing mechanisms for doing dodgy stuff on the network. So that's the disincentive there. And then there's a whole bunch of game theory that goes around goes with it as well, where it's actually more profitable almost always to just play by the rules of the network than try to attack it. But obviously, we're trying to build these networks to resist nation states, and nation states don't necessarily care too much about profitability or anything like that because they have essentially unlimited military budgets a lot of the time, and they can just kind of keep attacking the network and kind of like try to destroy the network that way. But I don't, that's kind of like the end game. It's not something that a lot of people think about, but for me, I want Ethereum to be able to survive that. So that's why I'm like a very big kind of like advocate for people running their own nodes, for keeping Ethereum's base layer as decentralized as possible. And decentralization leads to security as well. Like, as I was just talking about, Solana trying to do everything at kind of like layer 1 and having kind of like such a, I guess, like having a network that's so prone to getting spammed led to it being offline. And that's a liveness kind of failure for 18 hours, which means, like, that, to me, that's actually like, if that happened on Ethereum, I would consider that to be a very, very bad thing. Like, I would consider that not to be something that kills Ethereum, but it would kill a lot of the credibility in Ethereum, because 18-hour outage for people kind of like not being able to access their money, not being able to kind of like save their positions, because with an outage, there's a lot of kind of like second order consequences of it as well, where essentially, if the price of like ETH was to deviate too much from the price that when kind of the network went offline, say the price was $3,000, and then when the network came back online, it was $2,500. Well, you have like a lot of stuff that could go wrong. There's a lot of people that would get liquidated instantly. There's a lot of MEV that would go on. A lot of like the AMM pools would go crazy, and a lot of that stuff can kind of happen very easily. And on top of that, as I said, it will kill the credibility in Ethereum there as well. So decentralization allows us to make these networks anti-fragile. So you see with like Bitcoin, it's always running. Like, it's for all the crap I give Bitcoin and for like how bearish I am on it, I mean, it is incredibly anti-fragile, where the network just continues to run. It keeps producing blocks. Nothing fancy goes on. I mean, that's also because they don't really do anything to upgrade the network through hard forks, and they move very, very, very slowly. So that's a trade-off that they take. Whereas with Ethereum, we do move a bit quicker, where we do regular hard forks, and they sometimes lead to errors. I mean, we saw recently there was the consensus bug, and then there was kind of like the the Geth kind of exploit, and then there was the Infura thing in December, where Infura didn't kind of like update their nodes, and kind of like there was another exploit that was triggered. So I mean, yeah, these things happen, but Ethereum being kind of like decentralized and secure, and people running their own full nodes and things like that make it so it's less kind of like bad than something that's like totally centralized. So that's kind of like the things on the nodes and validators. But as I said, that's just one kind of like small aspect to it. I think another big aspect is how decentralized is kind of like the governance process of getting upgrades into the network. So for Ethereum, and I think I answered this on the last AMA that I did, its governance process is extremely decentralized. It's not using on-chain governance. It's using something called basically, you could call it off-chain governance, but it's basically called rough consensus, where we basically look at the ecosystem. We look at the social signals from various different parties within the ecosystems, whether they just, regular community members, nodes, economic kind of like entities such as exchanges, miners and validators, of course, and stuff like that. The core devs, app developers, all that sort of stuff. We look at all of that. We take all the information in, and then we come to a decision of, okay, should this EIP, which is an Ethereum improvement proposal, be included in the network or not? So And for Ethereum, because the community is so diverse and because there's so many different players and it's such a large community, it has a very great kind of like decentralized governance process because of that. Now, some people will argue, well, it's more of a technocracy because there's a bunch of core developers that have the final say, but I don't actually think the core developers have the final say. They do have a lot of weight, obviously, because they know the protocol better than anyone else. And if they refuse to build an EIP, well, then it's not going to get built unless someone else I guess, steps up to the plate here. So they do hold power in that regard, but them blocking an EIP is much different to them being able to get a malicious EIP into the network. And they wouldn't be able to do this because people would notice this and they'd push back on it, which has happened before. We had ProgPower, which the community basically said, no, we don't want this, where some core developers were actually in favor of this, and then eventually the core developers were like, well, there's actually not consensus here, so we're not going to go ahead with it. There was also a few others like EIP 999, which was the EIP to unlock the frozen funds and due to the parity multi-sig kind of wallet hack. The community basically said, no way, no, this isn't happening. And then obviously there was the DAO fork, which was incredibly controversial. The community was much smaller, and I actually wouldn't say that it was anywhere near as decentralized as it is today, but there was that DAO fork where essentially the people who didn't want to, continue on with the forked Ethereum chain stuck with Ethereum Classic, which is the chain where the hacker retained all the funds that they stole from the DAO. So there's that kind of like governance process there that goes into it, but that's another big aspect to it, the decentralized governance process. Another aspect is that kind of like relates to that is the social layer. Like, how good is your social layer? Do you have people who actually care about the chain? Do you have people that care enough to run a full node? Do you have people that care enough to point out if something's going wrong with the chain, if a direction that the developers are taking is wrong? Do you have enough people to call out, as I said, like bad EIPs or EIPs that don't necessarily improve the network, they're actually detrimental to it? And do you have people to speak up and defend the ecosystem and defend Ethereum? And can they do this in a decentralized way? Are they not, are they independent? Are they not funded by, the Ethereum Foundation, for example? And I think Ethereum has a lot of these people. There are tons of independent community members. I mean, obviously, I'm one of them. Bankless. There's kind of like I'm just going through the list of the media organization. So you got DeFi Dad. I mean, you got the Defiant. There's so many now, and then you have all the individual community members as well. Such as all of you guys. You guys can either have a voice or not. Like, even if your voice isn't on Twitter and you don't have like a lot of followers, you can have a voice within Discord channels. You can jump into the core dev Discord channel and be like, hey, I thought, this is a bad thing for such and such reason, or I think this is good and we should do it for such and such reason. And anyone could submit an EIP. Like, you can just go submit it on GitHub, give your reasoning behind it, and then you just have to rally support around it. You can basically go to various community members and say, hey, I really think this EIP would be cool to get into the network. And then, that person may think it's cool as well, and then it'll spread from there and you'll get consensus on it. And then you'll have like kind of, I guess, this EIP going to the network eventually. So there's the social layer aspect to it, which is a big part as well. And then, I mean, there's a lot of kind of like, I guess, cursory things about it. I guess things that may not directly play into it, but bolster Ethereum's decentralization. So I think, like, how decentralized is the liquidity for ETH as an asset? Like, how many exchanges is ETH listed on? Well, it's listed on every exchange. It's not just controlled by one exchange. One exchange can't just delist ETH and then ETH as an asset would disappear tomorrow. That can't happen. So the kind of like the trading and the liquidity for ETH is very, very distributed and even on chain as well. And then you have the token distribution. How good is ETH's token distribution? Well, I think it's one of the better ones in the ecosystem. ETH originally had like an ICO where they sold to the public without KYC. There was no kind of like insider sales or anything like that. Everyone got the same terms and everyone could buy at that sale. And it was done at a time where I guess like blockchain was very different, or crypto was very different in 2014, like very, very different to what it is now. And then on top of that, you've also had a period over like 5 years, 6 years where miners have been kind of like mining new ETH and distributing that to the network, all while a lot of people within the network have realized a lot of different gains. So if you bought in at the ICO at 30 cents, well, you probably sold on the way up to $100, and then you probably sold on the way up to $1,000. And, I'd be surprised if anyone that bought at the ICO, well, I think most people who bought at the ICO probably have sold a large chunk, or at least some of what they've had, or if not all of it at this point. So you had that kind of like distribution go there as well. But on top of that, you've also had the distribution from the various market cycles that ETH has been through. So just off the top of my head, ETH started at 30 cents, went to, I think, $1 when it first opened for trading, then went back to 40 cents, went up to like $20 during 2016, then went back to like $7, then went to $420, 120, $1,400, $80, back to kind of like 360 in 2019, then back to like $80 in March 2020, and then now we're at what we're at, right? So there's been a very, very long distribution phase where ETH is pretty well distributed, and it's not it's Gini coefficient, which measures kind of like distribution, kind of like the wealth effect, is not like amazing. There is still kind of like centralization there, but I think it's the best. It's probably the best besides Bitcoin in terms of distribution of these crypto networks, and that's a very, I guess, especially for a proof of stake network, that's very important for decentralization. That one entity that doesn't own like a lot of the supply. I don't know how much like a single entity owns. Like I think the largest kind of contract on Ethereum that owns the most amount of ETH is definitely the deposit contract right now, which is obviously many different people's ETH, and then you've got the wrapped ETH contract, which is the same thing. You have exchanges, which are individuals ETH. It's not the exchanges ETH themselves. So I don't know. Maybe there's someone who owns 1% of all ETH or something like that, or a couple percent. Maybe Joe Lubin still has a nice stash. Like he was obviously very early on ETH and stuff like that. But even him, like to fund consensus, he sold ETH through the years. So even he distributed a lot of ETH that way as well. So I think that plays a very big part in the overall decentralization of Ethereum, especially in a proof of stake world. So yeah, hopefully that kind of like answers your questions there, Fran, around how I think about it. As I said, read the blog post from Balaji called "Quantifying Decentralization." It's a very good post. It's very important. And then I would also read Vitalik's blog post. I can't remember the exact title of it. I think it was one about credible neutrality, and then kind of like something about the social layer as well. So you can probably just Google for those ones. They're actually really good to read too. All right, on to the next questions here. So one from Yorn the Fawn, who says, do you think the recent invention of interface into NFTs represent the birth of metaverse primitives? Interface NFTs, not actually exactly sure what you mean by this question. Maybe I'm not understanding it correctly. Interface NFTs. Maybe he's talking about loot. I think, you might be talking about loot here. Hopefully I get this right. So Loot was basically this NFT project that kind of like was deployed by, I think, the co-founder of Vine, and essentially what it is basically a picture of a bunch of 8 different kind of like RPG related items, where essentially it was just text on a kind of like on a JPEG, where there was no art, there was no kind of, I guess, like direction. It was basically like this bottoms up approach to NFTs, where everyone could kind of latch onto this and build their own world around it. It was just like, it's kind of like you're throwing a bunch of kind of like ideas to people and seeing what they do with it, essentially, instead of kind of like saying, well, this is what you should, this is what I'm doing with it, and then everyone can kind of follow me. It's kind of like, well, this is what I think is cool. Here's a bunch of ideas. Go kind of like do something with it. So I think I've talked about this on the refuel before. I think it's a cool idea. I think the bottoms up approach is really powerful. I mean, it's kind of like how a lot of the things in Ethereum just kind of like happen just naturally through the grassroots movement of Ethereum. But generally, it gets very speculative too. I mean, the loot stuff was super speculative, especially with like they had that A gold token and all the different loot derivatives. And it's kind of like dangerous when you fall into that sort of stuff and trying to speculate on things. You can either lose money through the hype, just like any project. But I think the long term is bright for these sorts of things, especially if they're very grassroots and start from like a non kind of like top-down approach, like a bottoms-up approach there. So hopefully that is a correct answer to your question, Yorn there. If not, feel free to kind of like ask it just in the Discord channel. All right, I'm just going to break here for a drink. One sec, guys. All right, next one comes from Dom here, who says, what do you think is going to happen to all these projects on layer 1? For example, let's say I have a significant amount of ETH deposited in collateral in Aave and forget about it for 5 to 10 years. And by that time, Ethereum's L1 becomes a settlement layer and all projects migrated to L2. Is there any risk that Aave on L1 would shut down and I lose access to my funds? Or will it always be possible to withdraw by virtue of smart contracts existing immutably on the blockchain? So it depends on what smart contract, right? Like a lot of these DeFi apps and smart contracts have multi-sigs attached to them, so they're not actually like decentralized. Pretty much most of them work like this. I would say the example of something that's totally decentralized and can't actually be be kind of like shut down, so to speak, the Uniswap smart contracts. So, fun fact, Uniswap V1 smart contracts are still live on the network today. So if you had liquidity in V1 from years ago, you can go there and withdraw it right now if you want to. Same with V2, and the same will be true for V3 and any future versions that Uniswap does. So from that perspective, you could withdraw it from that, but a lot of the other ones don't have this, and who knows if they're going to have it in the future or not. But I think it's funny because a lot of these projects are just going to. I think a lot of these newer DeFi projects, especially newer versions of these DeFi projects, are going to deploy to L2 only. They're not going to even deploy to L1. And we've seen this happen actually quite a bit recently with various different projects. One on the top of my head is Lyra that deployed just to Optimism. They've never deployed to Layer 1. They don't plan to either. So I think we're just going to be in a transition phase here where I don't necessarily think any of these protocols will choose to shut down on Layer 1, even if the fees get really, really high. But I do think to play it defensively, you probably shouldn't have your funds in something that has an admin key attached to it, and you shouldn't keep your funds in anything for 5 to 10 years, like any smart contract, just generally because it's like obviously more bugs that can go on in there. And I don't know like what reason you would have to leave money in Uniswap for 5 to 10 years or money in kind of like Aave or Maker for 5 to 10 years, unless you've taken like a super long-term loan and you think that you can't get liquidated no matter what. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like something that a lot of people will do. And generally, yeah, I mean, my cold storage is not a smart contract. It's not a DeFi contract. It's kind of like just like a normal kind of Ethereum address that lives on my hardware wallet. So from that perspective, even if I guess like one doesn't get expensive and it gets cheaper or whatever, it doesn't really matter. I think just the principle of not keeping your funds in a smart contract for a very, very long time is probably the best way to go about it there. But yeah, any of the ones that are like totally immutable and totally decentralized, like the Uniswap ones, you could potentially, if you wanted to, leave it in there for a long time, but you still deal with the risk of bugs, of course, like any kind of like bugs that were not noticed for a very long time, but suddenly they were noticed and someone exploits them, you could stand to lose some funds there. So hopefully that answers your question, Dom. All right, next one comes from JVR Lux, who says, what about decentralized and based in Ethereum smart contracts, sports bet, and gambling? I saw many decentralized websites accepting ETH and BTC, but that's not my interest. It would be great to have bets based on smart contracts and oracles like Chainlink, uploading sports results, or bets about the new name of the baby of the Queen in Australia. If we have a Queen of Australia, if we have this in L2, could be much cheaper in commissions for the issuer, so more gains for the users than current centralized bet sites. So the funny thing is about crypto betting is that it has a bit of a colorful history. It was very, very, very popular in the earlier days of crypto, especially in the earlier days of Bitcoin, where people would go and kind of like gamble on these things. One of the most popular ones was Satoshi Dice that Eric Voorhees founded and sold for a few $100,000 Bitcoin, not a few $100,000 of Bitcoin, a few 100,000 of Bitcoin, because at the time they were worth very little. But he sold that, and essentially, since then, there's been kind of like some here and there, and there's been prediction markets as well, like Augur and Polymarket and stuff like that. But generally, it doesn't seem that gambling has taken off. And I think it definitely has to do with the fees. You can't really have gambling where you say to people, well, you can chuck $50 into kind of like this bet, but it's going to cost you $50 in fees to do that. Well, no, that's not going to work. So you definitely need layer 2. I know that Polymarket uses Polygon. I know that there's kind of like Pull Together, which is focused. It's not exactly a betting app. It's more of a kind of like a lottery, but like a no loss lottery. They're exploring doing layer 2 cross chain stuff to lower fees for people as well. So yeah, I definitely think it just comes down to a cost thing, and I'm curious to see what the first kind of, I guess, runaway betting like app on layer 2 is. Maybe we'll see it in the near future, maybe we won't. I think it's funny because at the moment it's probably more profitable just to do massive liquidity mining or Ponzi farms than it is to make a proper kind of like sports betting website, sports betting app, or just betting apps in general, and it's probably less risky. I think gambling and betting apps are very heavily regulated. Services are very heavily regulated in the centralized world. So if you're deploying one, you'd probably have to do it anonymously, and then you'd have to be very careful about not kind of like revealing your identity and stuff like that, just in case regulators come after you. It's a lot more risky than a DeFi app, that's for sure. So those are kind of like, I guess, probably my thoughts on that, JVR. I do think it definitely comes down a lot to the fact that the costs are just too high for most people at the end of the day. There's no way you can have people just doing small bets and, when they have to pay $50 worth of fees, right? So, yeah. All right, on to the next one from You're on the Phone, who asks about ultrasound.money. When you click on OpenSea in the burn leaderboard, it takes you to a specific contract address on Etherscan. Does that specific address represent an NFT? I tried pasting the address into Twitter, but the search results were what looked like a bunch of bot spam posts containing the contract address in the tweet. Have you experienced this? That OpenSea on ultrasound.money, that contract is basically the contract that all of the transactions go through, all the sales go through. That's how OpenSea kind of like takes their cut. That's how they handle listings and buys and sells. So that's the contract that you're seeing. It's kind of like when you see Uniswap on that leaderboard, and that's the Uniswap smart contracts powering the whole DEX, and that's what everyone goes through, just like everyone goes through the OpenSea contracts when they're buying or selling using the OpenSea website. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question there. All right, one here from Lucas who asks, maybe a bit technical, but can an Ethereum transaction be stuck forever in the mempool? I think on Bitcoin it gets dropped after 14 days or so. I don't actually know the technical answer to this. I think there may be a kind of like limit to this, and there may be a point where the nodes will kind of like drop your transaction from the mempool. Before, if it hasn't been mined in a certain amount of time, so it's kind of like how Bitcoin does, but I don't actually know the kind of like answer to that. I don't believe it can actually be stuck forever. I have seen, some people, some of my friends tried to get like super cheap transactions in, kind of like, and then those things get dropped, but it depends, I guess, what node you're using, because if you're using a third-party node, they may have more aggressive kind of like settings in place to drop transactions, but I don't know if it's hard-coded into any of the clients. It may just be kind of like a flag that you have to do where you're like, okay, we'll drop this transaction if it hasn't processed in a kind of like specific set of time. Maybe there's a default in Geth or kind of like any other clients. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to check up on that for you. And then Lucas, your second question here, what's your value proposition for Matic? I can see they're good products, but why should this make the token more valuable? For me, it looks like more like a money grab, with the only difference that they market themselves as Ethereum friendly. So I should say, I can't really, I'm not going to be able to go into too much details about why Matic should be valuable, why it shouldn't, obviously because I'm an advisor to Polygon and I'm being compensated in Matic tokens, so I don't want to kind of like be a shill here, but I will talk about, I guess, Polygon more broadly and about their products and about why they are Ethereum friendly and why the other kind of like L1s or most of the other L1s aren't considered Ethereum friendly. So with Polygon, they have a bunch of different solutions, right? They have their most popular solution, which is the POS chain, which technically it's kind of like a hybrid. They have their own validator set. It's not like a layer 2. It's, commonly referred to as like a side chain or a commit chain or something like that. But the funny thing about the Polygon POS chain is that it actually can't exist without Ethereum, because all the staking logic lives on Ethereum. So if Ethereum was to go offline, the Polygon POS chain goes offline. But that doesn't make it a layer 2. It definitely isn't a layer 2 like a rollup, for example. But it definitely isn't its own layer 1. It's kind of like a hybrid between kind of like the two there. Like a side chain or like a commit chain, but even the side chain term is pretty loaded. But anyway, I don't want to get hung up on that sort of stuff. I want to kind of like talk about the other solutions they have. I mentioned earlier how they now are doing like a roll up with Nightfall, with EY called Nightfall. They also recently acquired Hermes, which is a ZK roll up on Ethereum that's live today. They're committing $1 billion to ZK roll up, not ZK roll up, zero knowledge research in general. They have a bunch of different products out there as well, like the Polygon SDK. They have Polygon Avail, which is going to be a data availability blockchain, which is going to be really great for rollups as well. So they've got a bunch of different products out there. Now, in terms of like the value proposition for Matic as a token, well, without getting too kind of like in the weeds here, right now, you need Matic to pay for like transaction fees, right? So that's a demand driver for Matic, the token. And then you also have, if you want to become a validator, you have to stake your Matic. So it's a staking token as well. Maybe in the future, it becomes like a governance token. Maybe the community says, well, we want to use our Matic tokens to govern the Polygon kind of like ecosystem or whatever. Maybe that's what happens there. Maybe they introduce a fee burn where they burn Matic tokens. So, there's lots of different things you can do to drive value to a token at the end of the day. I'm not, privy to kind of like any kind of special information here. I don't know what's going to happen there with that sort of stuff. I do think that they should make ETH a fee token option as well. I would like to see that because it's just easier from a user standpoint. But if they wanted to, they could do ETH as a fee token and then just use that ETH to buy Matic and burn it, for example. Like they could still drive value back to Matic even if ETH became the fee token. So there's that aspect. And then finally, you said, like, what makes them, I guess you asked, like, what makes them Ethereum friendly as opposed to these other kind of like ecosystems out there? Well, the Ethereum friendly is like both on a technical and social level. I think Polygon on the social level have always signaled that they want to scale Ethereum. They started off as Matic Network, which was originally, Plasma, a layer 2 on Ethereum, and then Plasma didn't really take off, so they made this POS chain, which is actually not a long-term solution. The POS chain is a short to medium-term solution as a kind of like release valve for the Ethereum network to keep people within kind of like the Ethereum ecosystem, the Ethereum family on the social level, so that when we have the L2s ready, they can kind of like use those L2s, and then the POS chain may even become an L2 eventually. But then, Polygon's going to be releasing more of their own L2s, more of their own kind of like generalized rollups. I mean, Hermes itself is going to become a generalized EVM compatible ZK rollup, and they're working on something called the ZK EVM, which from all of the people that I've spoken to looks like magic. It actually is really, really cool tech. So you have that aspect to it. But the social signaling side is what I mean when I say they're Ethereum friendly, and it's a reason why I joined as an advisor. I mean, one of the reasons. I mean, the other reason is because they're working on layer 2 stuff as well, and I think that's really cool. I want to help them with that. But the reason why the other networks aren't is because you can see that they want to compete or usurp Ethereum, right? Like Solana is a new layer 1 where they basically say, well, we don't actually think the way Ethereum is going is long-term sustainable. We think that it's stupid. We want to scale everything at layer 1. We don't want to do the layered scaling approach. Then you have Avalanche, is another layer 1 that's kind of like been in the news lately. They have their own architecture. They have the C chains where each C chain can be something different. Right now their popular C chain is the EVM compatible one. And then you have a bunch of other projects there's outright scams like Tron. There's Cardano, which is definitely very competitive with Ethereum. I mean, Charles himself probably wants to kind of like usurp Ethereum just so that he can essentially, be better than Vitalik or whatever. Which, I mean, I know it sounds silly, but this is like all on the social level here. This has got nothing to do with the technicals. It's got to do with the social stuff when you look at that kind of stuff. And then other ones like Polkadot, which is just, again, a different design philosophy of how to build a blockchain. Again, Gavin Wood, one of the co-founders of Ethereum, did a lot of really great stuff for Ethereum early on, but then had a difference of opinion, I think, with much of the team, especially Vitalik. So he's like, well, I'm just going to go build my own thing, which is fine. I think Polkadot's a legit project, even though I disagree with a lot of the kind of like things that they're doing, and I don't actually think that their architecture is one that is long-term sustainable or really great at the end of the day. But I don't want to kind of like trash them or anything. And then you have like Terra, for example, which I actually don't think that Terra is an Ethereum killer or has positioned themselves as being an Ethereum killer. They're actually adding a lot of value to Ethereum because they have a bridge that goes into Ethereum and they're bringing a lot of liquidity in. And I think Terra's kind of like this ecosystem where they're definitely focused more on, I guess, like, I wouldn't say CeFi side of things, but more on kind of like the payments, traditional finance side of things, because they're very big in, I think, South Korea with their payments infrastructure, and then they're kind of like working as like a front door into other parts of the ecosystem. So I think Terra is actually one that has never positioned themselves as being a killer or the community's kind of like being like toxic to Ethereum or anything like that in a large way. I mean, there are parts of communities that can be toxic to one another, but I don't think it's ever been in a really large way from what I've seen anyway. And then I'm just going to go down the list. I mean, there's other ones here. Like, I mean, if you look at all the layer 1s, pretty much, I think what most of them do is that they basically say Ethereum's architecture is shit, Ethereum's technology is old and kind of like useless, we're going to build a better system. It really comes down to that. And that bleeds into the social layer, which kind of like bleeds into the community, which bleeds into Twitter. And then you see all these people saying like, oh, Ethereum's dead because the gas fees are really high. Long term, this is gonna collapse and whatever. And they don't really care about learning about like how Ethereum is actually going to scale. So from that point of view, the Polygon community is nothing like that. The Polygon community is the Ethereum community. It's the same community. They're all aligned on scaling Ethereum. They're all aligned on kind of like being part of this ecosystem. I'm sure all the Matic holders hold ETH as well. It's not like it's either or for them. It's kind of both. It's kind of synergistic and symbiotic there. And as I said, Polygon's technology, even though the POS chain, some people consider to be a separate blockchain to Ethereum, it doesn't matter because they're actually building layer 2s on Ethereum as well. Whereas these other competing blockchains, like the ones I just mentioned, they're not building layer 2s on Ethereum. They're not adding any value to Ethereum. They're actually trying to sap value from Ethereum, whether that be kind of like harping on about the high gas fees or basically getting their community to go out into the wild and kind of like fight Ethereum in various different ways. So that's kind of like what I think the major differences are between, I guess, Polygon and every other, I guess, layer one out there. And as I said, like the POS chain is very, very, very kind of like weird because it's definitely not a standalone layer one like these other chains are, but it's definitely not a layer two. So, and then on top of that, Polygon is not just a POS chain. They've already got the SDK available. They've already got Avail on DevNet. They still have the Plasma chain live as well, which it's not really used, but it's live. As I said, Hermes is live. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think Polygon at this point has more than shown that they're very Ethereum aligned and very Ethereum friendly and want to add value to Ethereum rather than extract value from it. But again, I'm an advisor to Polygon, so you can take what I said as me being biased or not, but I try to give an unbiased take, and that's kind of like how I see it at the end of the day. And you guys just kind of have to trust me that I'm not just saying it because I'm an advisor. I mean, I could say some negative things about Polygon, but not negative, but I think like what I didn't like was how some of their marketing was focused on calling the POS chain a layer two. I think that was not something that was really great, and I don't think they've done that lately. And I kind of like gave my feedback on that. But generally, I don't think it was done out of malice or anything like that. I think it was just done out of, I guess, kind of like maybe confusion. I think for a long time, people have kind of like confused sidechains and layer twos, and depending on like who you are, like obviously the Polygon founders aren't running the Twitter account, right? So if it's just some kind of like the marketing department, well, for them, layer two sidechain, whatever, it's all the same thing at the end of the day. But not trying to excuse what happened, but I think that that's kind of like something that I got a little bit upset about. But at the end of the day, the Polygon ecosystem does include layer twos as well. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. Moving on to some of these other questions in one sec. Just going to get a drink. All right, a couple here from Dom. So first one from Dom. You have mentioned in Wednesday's newsletter, so this would have been about a week ago now. Not a week ago, sorry, a few days ago now. You have mentioned in Wednesday's newsletter that when most activity happens on layer two. Okay, so for those of you who haven't seen this newsletter and want context around this was the newsletter on the Daily Gwei called The Grand Design, where I talked about Ethereum's kind of like long-term design with roll-ups and stuff like that. So you can check that out for extra context. But essentially, what Dom is saying here is that, when most activity happens on layer two, proofs batches will use up layer one gas so much that it will outprice all other layer one transactions, even for whales. But at the same time, the beauty of rollups is that even if it goes offline, you can recover your funds by the L1 bridge contract. But wouldn't that constitute extremely expensive L1 transactions? I.e., if you had $5,000 on a roll-up that went offline, but it cost $25,000 to recover it from the bridge, and another $25,000 to bridge it to a different roll-up, then your $5,000 is effectively lost forever. How do you see a solution to this? Bonus points if it's a trustless and decentralized solution. So there's a few different ways to tackle this. I think the first way is that the same way as I was describing before, how you can have kind of like this public transportation system where you can kind of have like a pool of funds that gets deposited into, I guess, a layer two to reduce costs for everyone. I think that can happen in the reverse way as well, where it can be set up where everyone can kind of like withdraw to, or I guess like submit a kind of message to withdraw to a contract, and then they can all split the costs over that, and then it can get dispersed from there. So that's one way to do it. The second thing, and maybe I the more I think about this, and people brought up this line a lot where I basically said that L1 would be too expensive for even whales to use. I had a few people kind of like ping me about this and kind of like ask, do you really think this is going to happen? And I've had more of a think about it since I published this newsletter, and it's just really hard to tell, actually. I would actually say that I actually don't know what it kind of is going to look like here, because we don't know what it's going to look like with sharding. Like, let's say with sharding, we add 64 more shards. Now, the thing is these shards are just for data, right? They're just for layer twos to use. The shards won't be for execution. You won't be able to do on the shards what you can do on ETH1 today. But in saying that, the fact that these rollups have many more places to put their data and their kind of like proofs on, that means that the costs are going to come down considerably, right? Because I mean, the costs, the L1 fees may go down so much, but only for L2s, because the L2s are the only one who can post kind of like their data to these and their proofs to these shards. And then what ends up happening is that because your kind of like funds are still on the layer one here, you can still withdraw them to your Ethereum address, for example, and the cost is really, really low because you're using the shards to withdraw them. So it's yeah, I would say that I probably walk back this. I probably remove that part from the newsletter if I could at this point, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the fact that maybe we get to a point where sharding works so well that the aggregate transaction fees goes up, but the individual transaction fees goes down because of the fact that the shards are being used for layer 2 kind of like roll-ups instead, and we can keep adding more of them without having to kind of like blow out the scaling and sacrifice decentralization and security. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of extra color there about, I guess, some extra thoughts I've had since I put that newsletter out there. Because yeah, that line definitely struck a chord with a lot of different people for good reason as well. It made me think a lot more about it too. But I think at this point in time, it's hard to tell exactly what the future is going to look like with regards to sharding. But I think like all the research has been done. It's just about like, I mean, the research has been done on data sharding. Execution sharding, I don't think will come in like a big form. I think if execution does happen on the shard, it'll probably just happen for the bridge contracts at the end of the day, where you'll have each shard being able to kind of like be bridged in and bridged out of, which will fix this problem. But I don't think it'll be the thing where you can basically do everything you can do on ETH1 today on these shards, because that just, the complexity there gets really, really bad. Like from what I've read from a lot of Vitalik's posts, is that doing execution sharding just completely just makes things much more complex, and it puts a much heavier load on the network as well, like the beacon chain too, which we don't want the beacon chain to be working too hard, because then it can lead to other problems such as chain instability and security risks too. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question for you, Dom. Your second question, where you said, and this relates to your first one, what about all the stakers getting rewards? For example, a 32 ETH solo validator generating 5 ETH over time, presumably staking, depositing, withdrawing happens on L1. So how would those 5 ETH rewards make their way into circulation into the L2 world if getting them there is prohibitively expensive? Again, same kind of like answer to layer 1. I actually think there might be a way to do this where you could have you could have the same kind of thing where you pull the funds together, right? Where you kind of like share the load of the cost to bridge in. But maybe there's a way, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here. Maybe there would be a way to directly go from like your stake account to a layer 2, but I'm not sure that you could actually do that without extra trust assumptions, bypassing layer 1 altogether. Like maybe you could swap your ETH on one of these kind of, I guess, solutions such as Hop or Connext, which is probably going to be cheaper, and directly from kind of like your staking account here to get on there. But I think the answer to the first question still applies about sharding potentially bringing down transaction costs for bridging in and out of these layer 2s as well. All right, next one here comes from Chief Forever, who says, with the huge drop in L2 fees compared to L1, what do you see the impact being to capital flows once on L2? It would seem capital will be more mobile in search of a higher short-term returns, since the fees are so much smaller. Will this lead to more short-term reward scenarios, or will rewards flatten out to avoid large inflows, outflows? So I guess this relates to kind of like liquidity incentives. I think while the fees are cheaper, it just depends, right? Because the liquidity incentives, say you've got like one farm over here that's offering you 100% APY, and then you have another farm over here that's offering you 200% APY. Yes, the fees are cheap to jump between them, but a lot of the time there's tax implications to this too. And I know this depends on where you are in the world, but if you're LPing in a pool, well, every time you LP in a new pool, that's a taxable event, CGT event. At least it is in the US and in Australia. And every time you withdraw from that, again, taxable event, CGT on the profit or loss. And then, kind of on top of that, kind of continuously moving between farms means that, say you move into the 200% APY farm. Well, what if that 200% only lasted for a couple of days? Well, then you have to move to that other farm and you move back there. But what if that kind of goes down as well? It kind of just becomes this thing where you're just hopping between different farms. And yes, the fees are cheap, but you're incurring all these taxable events for starters. You're essentially just overcomplicating things for yourself, and you're kind of like a dog chasing like a car, right? You don't know what you're going to do. So the way I kind of like view it is basically just like choosing a farm, sticking to it. Even if there are higher rewards to be had elsewhere, you're probably better off sticking to the one that you were already in at the end of the day. Unless the difference is major and you think that you're going to be able to get like a lot of APY out of this other one. But generally, I mean, yeah, to answer your kind of like core question, I do think we will see more outflows and inflows from these projects due to the lower costs, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. I don't think that I think it's going to be interesting to see how teams and projects react to this as well. Like, and I mean, my general thoughts on liquidity mining is a lot of it is really bad. A lot of it is very short-term minded. A lot of it destroys projects. And I would rather just see projects focus more on a very, I guess, modest liquidity mining program, but also just offering kind of like an actual product that users want to use outside of earning some token rewards for it. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question there, Chief. All right, one here from Unbank Yourself who says, "Hi Anthony, is it possible that one day selecting L1 or a specific rollup goes away and is handled on the back end? For example, I want to use Aave, I go to the app, decide I want to deposit X asset. This then triggers the back end to figure out what is the most cost-effective way to do so. As the end user, I don't know or care how it gets executed and whether on L1 or one of the rollups. I just know it's a transaction that was most optimally structured. Do you foresee something like that in a more mature state in the crypto space?" Of course, 100%. This is, I mean, the long-term goal of this ecosystem, just generally, should be to abstract away as much of these technical kind of like things as possible, whether they be L2s, whether that be just kind of like, I guess, having to interact with even things like MetaMask and having to kind of, I guess, have ETH for gas fees, all this sort of stuff. All that should be abstracted away. And on the kind of like L2 front, and a team that's working on this right now is Argent. So Argent has been teasing that they're going to be integrating directly with ZK Sync on the Argent mobile wallet app. So, and their mobile wallet app already kind of like abstracts a lot of this kind of stuff away from the end user and has a really great UX and UI there. So yeah, I fully expect that selecting a different, I guess, like L1 or L2 will just be completely in the background. And Coinbase has already announced that they're going to be adding support for various Ethereum scaling solutions like the Polygon POS chain, Optimism, Arbitrum, Starkware, and I'm sure all the other ones will be there as well. So yeah, it's definitely going to get abstracted away. So hopefully that kind of like gives you a bit of color around that. All right, I got 4 questions here from Patrick. So first one, you mentioned a couple of times that you were playing around with DYDX. What do you like, dislike about them? And what do you think they need to improve on? So the number one thing I like about DYDX is it feels like I'm using a centralized exchange without using a centralized exchange, right? Because it's a decentralized exchange, it's a layer 2 on Ethereum. And what I mean by that is that every time I do a trade, I don't have to sign a transaction on MetaMask. It just happens because that's just the way their layer 2 is constructed, where once you're signed in with your MetaMask address and you've generated your keys for that layer 2 account, you deposit your USDC in from layer 1. And then you can trade to your heart's content with leverage on, this kind of like order book based exchange, and it's really, really fast. There's no gas fees or anything like that, and you kind of don't have to sign a transaction anytime you do anything. Only when you like deposit, only when you want to withdraw from DYDX and stuff like that as well. So that's what I like most about it. I think the UI and the user UX in general is really awesome. One of the better ones I've seen in the ecosystem. Probably one of the top ones I've seen in the ecosystem. I like that I'm earning DYDX token rewards for trading on there right now, of course, kind of like a little bit of, I guess you can call it yield farming at the end of the day. I like that because it's I guess like in layer 2, I retain kind of like full custody of my funds because of the way the layer 2s work. I mean, we all know this by now. So, and I guess like what do I think that they could improve on? I don't know. I think they're doing really well. I mean, they have a lot of liquidity, which is obviously a pain point a lot of the time, but their liquidity right now is amazing. Like it's incredible because of the token rewards. They've been able to attract a lot of market makers to come into the kind of like ecosystem here. So I think maybe what I'd like to see them improve on is maybe I don't actually know. I haven't had any issues myself with DYDX, to be honest. Maybe allowing me to deposit not just USDC, but like ETH as well, because at the moment they only let you deposit USDC. I'm sure there's a technical reason for that, but I would love to deposit at least ETH as well into it, because a lot of the time I don't just have USDC lying around, but I have ETH lying around. So I'm happy to deposit my ETH in there, but I can't. And because of that, what ends up happening is that I have to either sell some ETH for USDC and then just trade it back to ETH on DYDX, which is silly because I incur taxable events by doing that. So I would just love to see them do, I guess, more deposit options. I'm not sure if it's technically possible for them to do so. I'm sure they've built the system in such a way where they've done it with USDC because it just simplifies everything. But I'd love to see them support ETH and maybe some other tokens, other stablecoins as well, like DAI. All right, second question. You mentioned also a couple of times that you like to play online games, especially World of Warcraft. Do your WoW friends talk about crypto? If so, what are they interested in? I don't really play too much with friends these days. When I was playing it like a long time ago, I had a guild and we all played together. I knew a lot of different people on there. But these days, I'll sometimes play with one of my friends. who's actually been into crypto since 2017, like I have. He actually listens to my refuel and everything like that. But he's more like a brother than a friend to me. I mean, we've been friends for a very long time. But I wouldn't say like anyone else that are kind of my friends in kind of like real life that I used to play WoW with are into crypto at all. They just never really kind of like dive down that path. And to be honest, I don't really talk to many of them much anymore. It's just I don't really have the time. And you know, as you grow older, you lose contact with a lot of friends. So yeah, like the funny thing is that I actually play World of Warcraft solo most of the time, even though it's an online game. I just like kind of like just leveling up my character and listening to a podcast. It's kind of like therapy for me. And yeah, I just when I do play with my friend, the only friend that I play with is someone who definitely is into crypto, and you know, he's been holding ETH since 2017 as well. Still hold. He hasn't sold any. I'm very proud of him for that. But yeah, so hopefully that answers that question, Patrick. Your third one. You have no interest in going deep into another ecosystem like Solana, right? Why is that? So I would actually argue that I've pretty much gone as deep as I wanted to at this point in Solana, where I've investigated the technology, decided that I don't actually think it's long-term sustainable. I don't think it's anywhere near decentralized enough or secure enough. I don't like the ecosystem that they have right now. Their community isn't my people, so to speak. It's definitely a different set of community members. So that would be why I don't really kind of like want to go deeper into it. But like secondly, I guess like not just Solana, but other ecosystems, it's pretty much the same thing where I don't have enough time to keep up with all these ecosystems at the end of the day. I barely have enough time to keep up with Ethereum, and I cover it every day in a newsletter and a video. So it's what I want to allocate my time to. And Ethereum is kind of like my whole life. It's what I'm all about. It's what I know most about. It's where I have all my friends and community in. It's what I believe is actually the most long-term sustainable solution in terms of like a smart contract blockchain. So yeah, time plays a big factor into it. But in saying that, if I saw an ecosystem that wasn't Ethereum that was actually interesting, I would spend more time within it. I would try and make time for it. I would actually carve out maybe even like a couple of hours a week to spend time in there if I really, really wanted to. But I just don't see that in any other chains right now. At least at least I haven't seen enough to want me, to convince me to kind of like take time away from focusing on Ethereum to focus on that sort of stuff. All right, your fourth question. Do you know if it's possible to let a swap just sit there and wait? For example, base fee 50 Gwei, you want to swap 1 token A for 2 token B. You enter a slippage of 1% and you enter a base fee of 39 Gwei. Now you wait. Finally, the base fee gets to 39 Gwei. Unfortunately, 1 token A is now worth 1 token B. Will the transaction fail and the user has to pay the whole transaction cost, or will it succeed? The transaction will fail, yes, because it will revert and say, well, I guess Uniswap will give you an error message saying that basically that the price has deviated too much from the original order and it can't complete the order. Now, if you had set your slippage to basically 100%, well, it'll complete the order. But I don't recommend doing that because you can get sandwich attacked like that. But your slippage being 1% definitely means that Uniswap or any kind of like AMM will reject your transaction if the price has deviated too much. Or it's deviated more than kind of like 1%. It's basically going to say, yeah, we can't match this order because it's invalid now, essentially. So yeah, that's kind of like the fail scenario for that. All right, a question here from Unbank Yourself again, who says, a question on security housekeeping. In the past, you mentioned how it's good to monitor any contracts you signed with unlimited value permissions or unlimited token, approval permissions. Wondering if you have any other good rules and practices to share to ensure most optimal security of our funds. Some others that come to mind are using a physical wallet like Ledger, not interacting with any edge or with miscellaneous tokens like AK Swap. Anything you could share beyond these items? Also, on a related note, if I sign into a website with my Ledger but use the sign function and not submitting any actual transactions, can that be exploited? So to answer your first question, I think you already covered a lot of you covered a lot of things I was going to say. Like a hardware wallet, definitely everyone with any kind of material amounts in crypto should be storing it in a hardware wallet. You shouldn't be storing it in a hot wallet like MetaMask or kind of like any other hot wallet. They should, you can use MetaMask in hot wallets. You can use them as kind of like pass-throughs as well. Like you can connect your ledger to MetaMask, of course. But there's definitely that. I would say that another reason why it's not that MetaMask isn't secure, it's the fact that like your PC can get infected with malware that targets MetaMask and stuff like that. So that's like a very big security risk there. Another big risk is writing your seed phrase when you kind of like create a new hardware wallet or create a new MetaMask account on your computer. You should never do that because you don't know if there's a keylogger on your computer. You don't know if one day there's malware gets installed and then you have like a text file with your seed phrase in it. They steal that, and then even if there's a password on it, they crack the password eventually and they have access to all your funds, all that sorts of stuff. So I would definitely not store it on your computer. But even if you physically write down your seed phrase or secret phrase on a piece of paper, you need to make sure that no one ever gets access to that piece of paper. So the things that I like to do when I kind of like write these down on physical pieces of paper is that, or not just me, but like what other people I know that are doing, they tend to split up the key into like 2 or 3 pieces, or split up the phrase into 2 or 3 pieces. Sorry about that. Where they basically kind of like get like, I guess if there's 24 words, they'll have like well, I mean, if they split it up into 3, it's like 8 words each, and they'll give it to like trusted family members, for example. But again, that's a bit risky because if that family member loses a part of it, you'll never be able to get access to your funds again. People buy safes, they store them in there. People do some fancy things like essentially like ciphers, or where they kind of like highlight a bunch of words within a book, and that's like their seed phrase. So there's a bunch of like things you can do like that. But for most people, I would suggest just like making sure you have a hardware wallet, making sure your backup phrase is stored safely somewhere in like, either in your own house or kind of like offsite in kind of like a family member's house that you trust or whatever, or in like a safe or anything like that. And then I would never write that kind of like seed phrase on your computer. Like I would always just write it physically down on a piece of paper. And yeah, as I said, use a hardware wallet such as Ledger or the Lattice One as well. And then kind of like your other kind of, I guess, a note here was about miscellaneous tokens that get airdropped to you, like AK Swap. You should never, ever, ever, ever pay attention to these tokens or do anything with them. Don't try to trade them on Uniswap. Don't give them permission to kind of be traded. Don't approve them for anything. Don't go to the website that they're advertising. Don't do any of that. It is like 9.9 times out of 10 a scam, and you will lose your money if you do this. So just like a warning label there, big kind of like warning label there, because if you give like this token approval to interact with your wallet, there could be something going on in that smart contract that allows it to withdraw other funds from your account as well. And if you go to the website, they may ask you, hey, you should put in your private key and you'll get access to these tokens. I've seen that happen plenty of times. Like not private key or seed phrase. And I've seen that happen before. Not good at all. So definitely you want to avoid those. And then you said your last thing here, if I sign into a website with my Ledger, but I use the sign function and not submitting any actual transactions, can that be exploited? So I guess it depends what you're signing, because when you sign something, you're signing a message essentially. So, when you sign into places, you're basically saying, hey, like, I want to connect my wallet to this website. I'm going to sign a kind of like transaction saying I'm connecting to this. And there's a bunch of other messages you can sign. I mean, I'm sure if you've done any voting on like Snapshot, for example, you sign a transaction saying, hey, I'm going to vote on this sort of thing. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think there are ways that you can get tricked into signing something accidentally, and that can be used against you. I have to check up on that, actually. I remember reading something about it, but I just can't remember off the top of my head. But definitely you want to check what you're signing at the end of the day, no matter what, depending, whether it's just kind of like something that looks innocent, or whether it's an actual kind of like some actual transaction on chain and stuff like that as well. All right, next question comes from J-Dubs, who says, I'm not a software engineer or lawyer. I was curious your opinion whether mergers, acquisitions in crypto, for example, Polygon acquiring Hermes network, are easier to implement than in the traditional world in regards to adding new code, handling the legal framework. Do you see future acquisitions in the blockchain industry to become more common, or most smaller projects will strive to remain independent? So from what I understand with the Polygon Hermes merger, they did a basic token swap where they took a snapshot and said, hey, if you own Hermes tokens, then we took a snapshot at this date, and then they've got like a tool now where you can trade your Hermes tokens for Matic tokens. So that was all handled by the Polygon and Hermes teams, where essentially Polygon said, well, we've got these Matic tokens in the treasury. We're going to use them to buy the Hermes kind of like team, or acquire the team. But we're also going to buy out all the token holders, which means they're going to essentially acquire and merge the network. So that's kind of like how it happened there. I'm not sure on the legal paperwork side. I'm sure there was a bunch of like legal documents and stuff in the background between the Hermes team and the Polygon team. But in terms of like the on-chain stuff, there was no, users didn't have to sign anything legally binding. They didn't have to do anything like that. I don't even think they had to KYC. It was just a straight token swap from the Hermes token to the Matic token. So yeah, and I don't believe there's any like legal frameworks around this or anything yet, just because it's so early in this sorts of stuff. But I think, yeah, I mean, we're going to see plenty more acquisitions like this happening. There's already been some of these in like the DeFi space, like a bunch of projects kind of, I guess, not getting acquired in the traditional sense, but getting kind of like brought under other projects. Like you saw with the Yearn ecosystem, they brought a bunch of different projects under their umbrella as kind of like an incubator, where those projects stayed there, had their own token and stuff like that. So there are various examples of this, but I'm not aware of any legal framework for this yet. It's just too early for that sort of stuff, I think. All right, a couple of questions here from Max Invests. First question, any tips on running a YouTube channel? Mine is nowhere near as successful as yours and is difficult to gain a following sometimes. I also want to get involved as possible, but this feels difficult. You have talked about how it's almost more difficult to come in now than it was a few years ago. So the funny thing is that growing a YouTube channel is not something that I've necessarily focused on, because if I was focusing on actually growing my channel as much as possible, I would do clickbait titles, I would do clickbait thumbnails, I would talk about price a lot more, I would just make more videos than I do now. I would do more frequent kind of like crappy videos. I would lower the quality of the channel, and that's what I've seen from a lot of the big kind of like crypto YouTubers. I would say like my channels are doing modest for kind of like what I've done with it, and I've done that on purpose because I wanted to attract a certain type of people to the community. I didn't want to attract the extreme speculators. I wanted to attract people who actually care about Ethereum, like I do. But in terms of like tips, it depends what you want out of it, right? If you want to be kind of like me, that you want to attract a certain type of person, well, you optimize for that. If you want to grow your channel as much as possible, then you have to do the clickbait stuff at the end of the day. That's a surefire way to be able to grow yourself. And you have to kind of like just talk a lot about price as well. It's funny because there are some successful channels out there that I know of that don't talk about price too often. They do a lot of educational stuff, but they do the clickbait and they do, thumbnail, clickbait title. So that seems to be a requirement. I don't think you can actually get around that. And I don't think it's wrong or anything like that. I think it's just the way YouTube is set up at the end of the day, and it's just really the way human psychology works. I mean, everyone clicks on clickbait once in a while, we all click on things that look more interesting on the surface, especially the thumbnail, than something that looks uninteresting. It's just a way to kind of like hook the person in. So I wouldn't consider that to be kind of like a detriment, but it depends on what kind of person you want to attract to your community if you're trying to build one. And then your second point here is like I mentioned, I personally mentioned before that it's harder to get involved now than it was back a few years ago, but that's just kind of like relative, because I think that, the more the ecosystem grows, the harder and harder it becomes to get involved, of course. But I started basically when the ecosystem was in 2018 and 2019, Ethereum wasn't like young. It was 4 years old at that point, in terms of like from idea to where it was, and the price had already gone ballistic, and there was kind of like a decent amount of community members. There wasn't that many, but it was much easier because everyone was still growing as kind of like an ecosystem. Ethereum was still growing. Ethereum, as I said, was very small, whereas these days Ethereum is much bigger. So relative to a couple of years ago, it is much harder to build yourself up as a complete newbie, but it's going to be even harder in a couple of years. So the best time to start was, yesterday. The second best time is today, as the old saying goes. So I would say that don't let it kind of like dissuade you from starting something and adding value. I know I have a friend in real life who actually has been doing this since kind of like just July. Like they're really new to the ecosystem. They've been learning for a few months, but since July, they've been getting involved with different ecosystems. They started a newsletter, and he just landed himself a job at an early stage kind of like DAO, which as a kind of like a community manager, which is awesome, right? Like that's so cool that's kind of like happened from there. And he came in like relatively late. And late as in relative to what it was in the past. So yeah, just like take that in strides, take it as an opportunity. There's a much bigger pool of people to tap into now as well, so that's the positive. So if you do want to start something new, focus on adding value. If you're starting a YouTube channel, focus on adding as much value as you can on the education side, because I think that's a really great way to grow. But at the same time, also you need to kind of like grow your other avenues too, like Twitter and stuff like that. I mean, I saw your tweet thread today, Max, that I retweeted. That was really great. Keep doing more of that. I'm happy to retweet good content on Twitter and get eyeballs on it, and kind of like use my following to bring other people up. But you need to put in the work. At the end of the day, you need to do it. You need to be consistent with it. I'm always talking about consistency, because that's what I did for so long. Is that I was very, very consistent with everything that I did, from ETHUB to Twitter activity to talking to people, getting to know people. And that's how I ended up in the position that I am in today. So yeah, just keep those things in mind. And I think that it doesn't matter how kind of like, I guess, late you feel in this ecosystem or how noisy you think it is, there is plenty of opportunity to kind of like grow yourself to being someone in this ecosystem. All right, and your second question was around loot and A gold, and you basically asking any thoughts around it after the hype has died down. You recently said that you didn't like the derivative system on top of it. Why is that? I think it expands the loot ecosystem further, and the original 8K should more or less hold value. So I would think that now that the hype's died down, I wouldn't say that I'm bearish on the project, but I would say that I'm very cautious on it. And I'm watching it kind of like, not closely, but I'm looking to see if it can actually form a community. Because I gave the example earlier about Sushi Swap, where they had all that initial hype and then it completely died off, and they had Mackie come in and kind of, I guess, like work with a small team of people to keep Sushi Swap going. Is Loot going to have that? I mean, I'm seeing there is still a very passionate community, but will that last long term? Will they be able to kind of like get people interested again? Will they be able to grow the ecosystem? Who knows? We'll see what happens there. So I wouldn't say I'm bearish on it. I would say that I'm just cautious about kind of like getting too caught up in it and just wanting to watch it kind of like play out and see how longer term how it kind of evolves from there. And then, you asked like, you said, you recently said that you don't like the derivative system on top of it. Why is that? I guess maybe I was too quick to say this. I do agree with you that a derivative system built on top of it broadens the kind of like player base and broadens the amount of people that can kind of, I guess, come into the ecosystem. When I said that, I kind of meant it as kind of like a bullish or bearish thing for like the original 8,000 loot bags. I don't know if the original is going to hold their value or not. I don't know if there's going to be kind of like prestige in holding original loot bag. So that's kind of like what I meant by that. But yeah, I agree with you. It kind of like expands the amount of people that can kind of get access to this. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm kind of like I don't like the derivatives. I more say, I guess, again, I'm just cautious about how they affect the rest of the loot ecosystem. All right, on to a couple of questions here from Blitzio. One, can you share your journey in becoming an angel investor to many prominent blockchain projects? And can you share any tips on as to how one can start? Is it mostly related to connections and being part of insider groups? How do outsiders like us find opportunities to invest in such rounds? So this is a bit of a hard question to answer, because I can give you like the answer that you might want to hear and the answer you don't want to hear. The answer you don't want to hear is that these opportunities are very hard to come by because of the fact that you need to kind of like build yourself up within the ecosystem over a long period of time. Now, I've spoken about this before on both, I guess, like the Refuel and in the AMA series, but the only reason I am in the position that I am in now where I get access to these deals is because I was extremely consistent and extremely involved within the community from earlier on. So for example, 2017, 2018, 2019, and the first half of 2020, nothing really happened in terms of, I guess, like massive growth for me. It was incremental, slow growth. It was kind of like grinding it out every day. It was not exponential. And then the bull market really hit its stride in mid 2020, especially when DeFi summer started. And then, since then we've had like obviously a massive kind of inflow of people and capital into this ecosystem. I didn't start angel investing until like, I guess, August or September of 2020. And my net worth was like tiny up until that point as well. It's funny because in March of 2020, when the COVID crash happened, I basically didn't have much money at all in crypto, even though I had been stacking ETH over the years, because ETH went back to basically $90 or $100. It wiped out a lot of my portfolio value, and then from there, obviously, it went up a lot more. And then DeFi happened, and I made some decent money there, so I was able to get like a bunch of capital to be able to invest into the kind of like angel deals that I got access to. But I mean, to the point I'm trying to make here is that they may have seemed like it happened overnight for a lot of people, but it's been a lot of grinding. It's been making a name for myself, building myself up within the ecosystem to get to that point where I'm actually brought on as an angel, because angel investors aren't brought on for their money at the end of the day. The money can come from the funds. They're brought on for their kind of, I guess, like position within the community, for their kind of like strategic alignment, if they can help with things in the background. For example, I help a lot of teams with hiring, with community related stuff, with marketing, with getting like eyeballs on their project because I have such a large reach and things like that. And kind of like if they want to just ping me about anything or to do with the ecosystem, I help them that way too. Whereas if you're just kind of like someone who doesn't have any of that kind of like value to add, you're just like a passive investor within the ecosystem, you may, be kind of like just on your own, doing solo things, learning on your own. Well, not to sound like a dick, but like the projects aren't going to want you on board because like you're not really offering any value to them, right? You're not offering the value that someone else can offer. And they usually have like limited spots for these sorts of things. So that's kind of like how it formed for me, is where like I obviously I hate tooting my own horn, but like just to make the point, I'm obviously like probably the most well known, if not one of the most well known people in the Ethereum ecosystem. So obviously, the projects that approach me are kind of like approaching me because they're like, well, we want Anthony on board because he's really well known. He knows what he's talking about. He's got connections. He's got a massive network, and that can help our project succeed, sort of thing. So if you want to get to that point, I would say you have to do what I was just saying to max invest, and what I was just answering Max Invest's question about, you have to build yourself up to this position, and it takes a while. It's grinding over time. It's doing it pretty much every day. It's doing things like being active within the community on Discord, on Twitter, being kind of like putting out kind of like, I guess, like educational materials is always good and stuff like that. So, and there's also, unfortunately, a wealth requirement to this as well. So, for a lot of these from pretty much all of them, there's accredited investor laws where you have to have a net worth of at least $1 million, or you have to have a income of $200,000, I think $200,000, $250,000, for at least 2 years, or a joint income of, I think, $300,000 with your spouse for at least 2 years, to even access these deals, because these are laws that have been put in place in various countries around the world called accredited investor laws, which I think are total crap. I think having a wealth requirement for this sort of stuff is really unfair to people, but that is also another massive hurdle, I think, for a lot of people as well, because even if you have a name within this ecosystem, you may not have the money, you may not have the wealth requirement for a bunch of different reasons out there. So that's a kind of like, I guess, shitty part of it. So hopefully that answers your question there, Blitzio, about this. I'm sorry that I can't give you like, I guess not a good answer in terms of like saying, oh, well, it's like, do this, and this, and you'll get to the point of where I am today. It's really not like a straightforward thing. It requires some luck, of course, but it definitely requires a lot of hard work and a lot of kind of like consistency and a lot of kind of like making sure that you build yourself up in the right ways. Because there's a wrong way to build yourself up and there's a right way. A lot of these teams, they don't want the total shills on board. Like the good teams, they don't want people who have a large audience but are just like total kind of like shills and look like scammers. They want like legitimate people who are actually adding a lot of value to the wider ecosystem and will not tarnish their kind of project with their brand and name at the end of the day. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question there. Your second question: What are the best practices in keeping your Ethereum L1 and L2 wallet transactions private or anonymous? I've heard of Tornado Cash. How does it work, and other viable options? So Tornado Cash is a great option, very viable option for just kind of like washing your funds through to different addresses if you want to do that. But generally, I mean, the easiest way to keep yourself private or anonymous or pseudonymous is to just kind of like have different Ethereum addresses for different kind of things that you're doing. I have my public address, and then I have like a lot of other addresses that I use for various different things. I create a new address for kind of like a lot of different things that I do. Like if I'm doing a new kind of like angel investment, I'll create a new address for that. If I need to pay someone and I don't want anyone to just kind of like see that, I'll create a new address for that. I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons for doing so, but that's like the most obvious one. But Tornado Cash is good for just washing funds through if you want to do it that way. You can go through centralized exchanges as well, which is not like very private, but still better than nothing, where you can basically wash your funds through them because they have like a hot wallet where the funds go into that is a shared wallet. So you can just kind of like deposit in and then withdraw from that wallet and it'll just look like a normal transaction. But you have to be careful, because if you deposit 10 ETH into the exchange and then you withdraw 10 ETH out of the exchange from the hot wallet, then people can kind of like map that if they wanted to. It's kind of like and they can use heuristics. They can kind of say, okay, well, how long did this transaction kind of like take to come through, and it's not very anonymous from there. So just generally using new addresses and finding them from centralized exchanges keeps you, I guess, like anonymous from everyone except the centralized exchange. But if you want to be totally anonymous where not even the centralized exchange can find you, then Tornado Cash is a good option there. There's also Aztec Protocol, but a lot of their tech's not live yet. And what they have is kind of like different to Tornado Cash. But yeah, so hopefully that answers your questions. Just going to have a quick drink break. All right, moving on to one from Yawn the Fawn. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer this question. I read it before, Yawn, and it's probably beyond what I've actually looked into. But I'll ask the question anyway, just so people know what I'm talking about. You asked about randomness on Ethereum. One of the special qualities of blockchain software is that each machine is running transaction code in a deterministic fashion to update the global state in a way that is identical between nodes, so that everyone is eventually in full agreement about the current canonical state. But if an Ethereum transaction invokes a smart contract containing a function with randomizing properties, wouldn't this break the determinism and result in different states between the different nodes? I don't think so. I mean, this is why I'm saying, like, I don't know if I can answer this, but I don't think so. I don't think this is how it necessarily works. I think, you actually can't get true randomness from Ethereum itself. You have to like use outside sources to do this. But I guess like maybe that's just a side note to this question. But essentially, I still think that the agreement would hold, right? The deterministic fashion would hold, because by calling that function, it is still a deterministic thing where the mempool will have you calling that function in it, and then whatever it returns after it's done is the randomized property, and that returns it within the kind of like block, and then it gets included in the block anyway. So I think that's the correct answer. I mean, as I said, I don't know for sure. I'm going to have to look into that. But I think that's the kind of like correct answer to that. And if it wasn't, I mean, we probably would have already seen the nodes falling out of sync and stuff like that if it wasn't the case. So I'm pretty sure that's the case there. All right, 3 questions here from Brian Peace. First one, the drama at OpenSea combined with the random spam tokens I sometimes discover in my wallets has me wondering about this hypothetical scenario. Let's imagine I'm an early employee at a startup which has become very successful. I have stock options that will eventually make me a very influential shareholder. I'm good at my job, but not irreplaceable. I just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Let's also imagine that there is some hypothetical entity that would benefit from not having to pay me my significant stock-based compensation package. Lastly, let's imagine this entity did some crafty shenanigans on-chain and then sent those ill-gotten gains to my public wallet address in an attempt to discredit me. How could I defend myself from those accusations? This is a pretty good thought experiment here. This definitely could happen, right? I guess like I mean, maybe, I'm just thinking out loud here with this kind of one, because you can defend your actions at the social layer, right? Where you can basically be like, well, I didn't do this. This wasn't me. These kind of like transactions came randomly from these other wallets that I don't actually own, blah, blah, blah. And it just depends if people are going to believe you or not on that kind of front there. On the technical front, it's quite hard because, there's no real way to kind of like prove that these other addresses aren't yours, because people can, because if people ask you, oh, well, prove these things aren't yours, it's like, well, you can't, because like you can prove that they are yours if you own the private keys to them, you can sign a message, but if they're not yours, you can't kind of like prove that. And then why would you prove that they kind of like are yours if you're trying to defend yourself against it? This question's got me a little bit stumped here. I think it really does rely on the social layer stuff here, and basically convincing people that you didn't do this and you weren't responsible for this at the end of the day. But I also think that it's funny because if you're referencing kind of, I guess, like the OpenSea drama here and thinking about what happened with Nate, I think it's pretty obvious that he was doing it because of the timing and some of his comments on Twitter. That kind of like got him, I think, thrown under the bus. But also internal investigations would would unveil this if the company has monitoring on the kind of like what the employees are doing on the company network. Then they could probably, I guess, put two and two together here. But it really would be the social layer at the end of the day. And the way you would defend yourself if you were at the company, well, the company would have to come out and defend you and say, well, we know this happened, he's telling the truth. And then I guess it's up to the community to believe you or not. So yeah, a little bit of a scary thing here. I guess maybe if you want to defend yourself against this from the very beginning, just don't have a public Ethereum address, which is kind of a shitty thing to give as advice here, because obviously you do want to have one for various reasons. But if you're worried about this sort of stuff, then yeah, definitely not having one would probably be the best way to go about it there. All right, your second question. When I bridge to a rollup, my funds are locked in the bridge contract and secured by Ethereum. So even if the rollup goes down, I can still exit my funds to Ethereum. But how does this work if I'm bridging between rollups? If I bridge from Ethereum to rollup A and then bridge from rollup A to rollup B and then rollup B goes down, can I still retrieve my funds on Ethereum? The chain of custody seems complicated. So if you're talking about bridging using one of these solutions like Hop or Connext, as I mentioned before, these solutions are cross-chain exchanges. They are not bridges in the sense that, or in the same kind of like sense that the bridge that lives on layer 1 Ethereum for these kind of rollups are. Because it's funny, it's called a bridge contract, but really it's more of a kind of, I guess, it does more than just bridging. The Arbitrum contract actually allows you to submit transactions on kind of like layer 1. As long as the validators are still online. You could do this when the sequencer went offline the other day. Just because the sequencer went offline doesn't mean you couldn't submit things to layer 1 because the validators were still online. It just means that it would incur layer 1 gas costs instead of getting the benefit of the sequencer costs, which brings the costs down. So the chain of custody here is basically wherever those funds in the kind of like the bridge sits for that kind of like for Hop or Connext at the end of the day. So if you had kind of like hopped between Arbitrum and Optimism, the funds on Optimism, if you want to withdraw them to layer 1, you would kind of like withdraw them, and then because those funds are allocated to you, they're owned by your Ethereum address on Optimism, then the corresponding funds in the bridge would belong to you. You know, just because you've kind of like hopped between these two different things doesn't mean that you don't own them just because someone else bridged in the funds. Just like if, for example, maybe I'll give you an obvious example here. Maybe I'm confusing people with this. Say you bridged in ETH into Optimism, and then you trade that ETH for USDC on Optimism, then you withdraw USDC. Well, you never brought USDC to Optimism, right? Like someone else did. So what ends up happening is that you've essentially swapped your kind of like tokens on layer 2, and then the bridge knows that you don't actually sorry, not the bridge, the layer 2 knows that you don't own that ETH anymore. They've submitted the batch to layer 1. So now the layer 1 bridge contract, which as I said, it's more than a bridge contract, but now that contract knows that you no longer own that ETH because of the batch transactions that have hit layer 1 now. And so that you can't withdraw that ETH to layer 1 anymore. You can only withdraw the USDC. And even if the layer 2 goes down, you will only be able to withdraw the USDC from the smart contract because it knows that you traded your ETH for USDC on the layer 2. Same principle applies between hopping between these different kind of chains. It knows that you now have ETH on layer 2 it knows you now have ETH on Optimism and not ETH on Arbitrum because that state change was updated on layer 1, and then the contract can see that, and then you can withdraw from there. So it's all got to do with just basically your Ethereum wallet at the end of the day. It doesn't have to do with the fact that, just because someone else bridged in those funds doesn't mean that you can't withdraw them yourself. So hopefully that kind of like clears it up for you. Interesting question. Definitely, I think I got that right. But definitely something that I think needs more clarity on. Maybe there should be a post in the Daily Gwei newsletter about that eventually. All right, third question. Polygon's roadmap to implement a ZK rollup is very exciting. I'm a big fan of Polygon, but at present, why is Polygon's current network considered to be more aligned with Ethereum than other EVM-compatible L1s like Phantom or Avalanche? Brian, I actually answered this. Where did I answer this? Just before. There'll be a timestamp on the YouTube recap if you want to kind of check that. But I answered this up here. I'm just scrolling through the questions. Who asked this? I think it was Lucas. So if you go to the question asked by Lucas, you'll be able to see that I answered that there. So I won't just rehash it here. And I answered why Polygon is considered more Ethereum friendly there. All right, a few more questions left here. So one from Jan. How will MEV look like in a roll-up world? Will this still happen as today on layer 1? Will it somehow move to layer 2 or something hybrid? MEV is well and truly alive on layer 2. It's just that we can do different things with MEV on layer 2. So there's a couple of different approaches that have been put forward. One of them is this approach called MEVA, or MEV auctions, which was put forward by the Optimism team quite a while ago, where essentially they would auction off the rights to people to do MEV. There's a bit of controversy around that. People think that's not really an elegant solution. They don't think it's something that's actually fair. They think it definitely just biases the people with the most money. So basically, I guess like a rich get richer thing. And the auction funds would basically go to public goods funding as well. It wouldn't be funds that went to the Optimism team, for example. But I think more generally with I guess like what should I say? Sorry. I got Discord notifications coming up here. More generally with MEV, there's just there's the same ways that we're mitigating it and that we're kind of like working around it on layer 1 apply to layer 2. But I mean, you've got the MEVA on layer 2. You've also got right now where essentially, because Optimism and Arbitrum run their own sequences and no one else can run a sequencer, they are the only ones that can do MEV right now. And they are they're not the only ones who can do MEV, but they can do it if they wanted to. They could make it so that no one else could do MEV, and they could front run transactions as well. So there's that problem too. But once that decentralizes out, it'll change. But I think MEV is a wide open topic. It doesn't matter if it's on layer 1 or layer 2. Wherever the sequencers or validators or miners, whatever, control transactions or control the ordering of transactions, I should say, there's going to be MEV, and there's good and bad MEV. Good MEV is arbitraging between different liquidity pools. So arbitraging between like Uniswap and SushiSwap liquidity. It's good MEV. Bad MEV is stuff like front running, sandwich attacks. Sandwich attacks are really bad MEV, that sort of stuff. So that's what we're kind of like working on to try and mitigate. There's a lot of bleeding edge research happening here. A lot of stuff on ETH Research Forum if you want to check that out. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Jan. So one here from Nick_BK who says, "Hi Anthony, I've read 2 of your Daily Gwei newsletters regarding stablecoins, and I would like to get an update on your overall view of the landscape and specifically your thoughts on Terra USD. UST is the ticker. Your newsletter outlines the 3 key properties to satisfy the holy grail of stablecoins: stability, scalability, and decentralization. Scalability, we've recently seen exchanges such as Coinbase and Kraken list UST, and it is currently the 5th ranked stablecoin in crypto in terms of market cap. Stability, a CoinGecko screenshot was posted by Do Kwon 2 weeks ago, the day of the flash crash, which showed that UST was the only stablecoin that held its peg, at least momentarily. The screenshot showed DAI at 94 cents, USDC at 95 cents, USDT at 94 cents, and UST at $1. Decentralization, would like to know your thoughts. Although the Terra USD is rooted outside of the Ethereum ecosystem, I would like to think that we Ethereums can root for great innovation that benefits the overall crypto space and welcome a multi-chain future, as we are not narrow-minded maxis such as Pomp." Okay. So I want to clarify one thing. When I say scalability about, I guess, like these stable coins, I definitely do mean kind of like market cap and being able to kind of grow over time. But I also mean kind of like scalability in the sense that the more kind of, I guess, scalable it kind of becomes, if it can scale while still remaining decentralized and stable. So these 3 things have to work in tandem. They can't just be a thing where, okay, well, you have like this stable coin that scales a lot, but is not decentralized, like the centralized stable coins, but it can be stable, right? Or you have one that's stable, but it's not decentralized, and it's not scalable. Like there's all these kind of different things you can chop and change. That's why I call it like the holy grail, having all 3 of these. I don't know enough about UST to comment on its decentralization. I know enough about it to comment on its scalability and stability. So from what I know with UST is that it's backed by the Luna token, and that to mint UST you burn Luna, to redeem to burn UST you get Luna back for burning it. So I know that's how it works. You can correct me if I'm wrong in the Discord channel if I got that wrong there, but that's kind of like what I know about it. And now this lends itself to, I guess, like being reflexive in both ways. If the Luna market cap goes up, you can mint more UST, but if it goes down, you have less UST. So it's basically a stable coin that scales with the price of Luna, which I don't know, like how I guess defensible that is, or how much that can scale. It's kind of like MakerDAO's original with single collateral DAI, where they had just ETH backing it up, and then they said, well, we can't scale with just ETH because there's not enough bandwidth here. We need to add other assets in. I'm not actually convinced that that's the right approach. I actually think that ETH may one day be worth enough to just be something that fully backs a kind of like stablecoin on its own, and maybe Luna gets to that point. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how far they can grow. I did mention before that I think the Terra ecosystem is interesting, and I don't think they're hostile towards Ethereum at all or anything like that. But that's one thing I would say about scalability. Stability, I mean, stability comes in many kind of different shapes here. I think UST had a mass depegging event during the flash crash of May when the Luna price fell dramatically because of the fact that Luna is the only token backing up UST. As far as I know at this point, maybe I'm wrong there, but I think that's the case, which means that you kind of like had a run on the bank, so to speak. That obviously goes down over time as the volatility of the Luna token goes down over time, but still definitely a little bit of a concern there when that sort of stuff happens. But in general, stability also means that there's very liquid markets for the stablecoin, so that when these kind of high volatile environments happen, the stablecoin can stay stable during them because there's various arbitrage opportunities, there's various kind of like bots keeping it stable and all that sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that as well. And then decentralization. I don't know enough about the Terra ecosystem to comment on this. What I do know is that I think Terra is a depos system that, and because of the fact that the UST, most of it, I think, is on, or a lot of it at least, is on Ethereum, it has to bridge into Ethereum. And those bridges always have centralized points of failure or always less trustless than just being on the chain itself. So there's definitely a decentralization trade-off there. And the Terra ecosystem, I mean, is probably not as decentralized as Ethereum, so there's also that risk as well. But hopefully that gives you a bit of color about how I'm thinking about that sort of stuff. Not to say that UST is bad or anything like that. I think it's great, but there's a lot of different issues that need to be worked through over time, which I'm sure they will be. But yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of extra color there. Take a drink break for a sec. All right, 3 last questions here, then I'll move on to some of the questions that I think have been asked in the AMA series channel. So, one here from Logmag who says, "Hi Anthony, warning, FUD incoming. I recently learned that all the L2s have admin keys that give devs total control over the TVL. Considering the massive amount of money flowing to L2s, it seems there are not enough disclaimers to highlight this circumstance. What, in your opinion, are the risks of L2s in these early days, and maybe some ideas to overcome these issues?" So, I frequently mention this on the refuel, in that things like Arbitrum and Optimism are completely centralized in terms of like the layer 2 network itself. But in saying that, they don't have unilateral control over the TVL on the chain, because of the fact that like you can withdraw your funds from layer 1. But what they can do is that with the centralized sequencer, they can censor transactions, they can front run transactions, they can basically do things that may not, they can basically do things with their sequencer that may not be what's the word I'm looking for here, that may lead to things where users lose funds and all that sort of stuff. And the L2Beat website does a really great job of highlighting this, where they go through all the kind of like trade-offs, what can happen, what's the worst case scenario, all that sorts of stuff. So I definitely recommend going and checking out that. But yeah, maybe there should be more disclaimers from, I guess, like Arbitrum on their bridge page, or Optimism on their bridge page, that basically says, hey, right now the network has a bunch of guardrails in place, there's transaction limits, there's centralized points of failure. Please be aware of this. Maybe they already have that in there, and maybe I just didn't pay attention to it. But yeah, that'd be cool to see on there as well. So, but yeah, if you want to know kind of like the full risk breakdown, go to l2beat.com. They have an amazing resource on this. They have like risks on every L2 out there right now. So definitely go check that out. All right, one here from Lloyd Banksy. What are your thoughts on the theory that a deflationary ETH detracts from the monetary premium narrative, as some level of inflation is good because it disincentivizes hoarding and leads to more distributed ownership? So I think I answered part of this question earlier on when I spoke about ETH distribution and how I consider ETH distribution to be very decentralized right now and very good. But I mean, you have a point going forward where much of the world hasn't bought ETH yet, hasn't onboarded into ETH yet. And so does a deflationary ETH detract from being able to, I guess, distribute these funds to a wider set of people? Well, the funny thing is that ETH is... So ETH is not deflationary at the protocol level. ETH is potentially deflationary depending on the fee burn. Right now, the Ethereum network issues 4.5% a year of kind of new ETH to secure the network to miners. Now, that is brand new ETH that's going into the ecosystem. Then you have the other side of the equation, which is EIP 1559, that is burning like 70-ish% of the fees, or all the fee revenue generated. Then once the merge happens and we go into a proof of stake world, there is still new ETH being issued. It's not like we've dropped issuance to zero and then we're just surviving on fees. There is new ETH being issued by the network to stakers who will eventually sell that to cover taxes. That's forced selling, or to take profits, or for whatever other reason. So that ETH will enter circulation, and that right now is at about 0.6%, I think, new issuance each year there, and that goes up as more ETH is staked. So maybe we get to 1% new issuance. And then the reason why ETH can be deflationary in that scenario still is because we're going to be burning the ETH that kind of like gets the transaction fee ETH. And I mean, we are burning it, but we're going to be obviously burning it once the merge happens as well. So, is 1% enough? That's maybe a question that you would ask. Like, is 1% enough to inflation to basically get ETH to the hands of a lot of different people? I think it's funny because I think it's actually that's probably not the question that should be asked. It's more about the question of like, how much, like, can people get access to ETH? How divisible is it? Well, it's divisible up to 18 decimal places. Okay, well, can they buy ETH if ETH is worth $100,000? Well, yes, you can buy like a fraction of an ETH. You can buy $1,000 worth of an ETH, and you can use that. Like by the time ETH's $100,000, the layer 2 ecosystem will be so mature that I don't even think end users will have to pay fees at all at that point. So at that point, you'll be able to do like these very small kind of like microtransactions and all that sorts of stuff on Ethereum. And I don't think that should take away from the fact that like Ethereum it can be net deflationary, where people don't necessarily hoard, because people still need to use ETH to pay transaction fees. People still need to use ETH to do things like within DeFi. The new ETH is still going to be sold for like tax reasons and for taking profits and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't see it being a long-term issue, but it is going to be interesting to see how it plays out over, I guess, like the coming years. All right, last question, not last question, but last question on my sheet from Sponge. Can you give an overview of StarkX? What trade-offs do ZK Starks have compared to ZK Snarks? On the technical level, I can't. This stuff is very technical. I would encourage reading Starkware's documentation, all this sorts of stuff. I haven't dived into it because it's very heavy on the cryptography. But basically, from a very high level, StarkX is, from what I can tell, Starkware's generalized kind of like roll-up ecosystem, where they're going to have a system where all their different kind of like roll-ups can talk to each other, and they can kind of like play with each other, they can have composability and all that sorts of stuff with each other on the StarkX kind of, I guess, network. So there's a lot of information about this through the different Starkware kind of like documentation websites and their blog posts and stuff like that. So definitely go check that out. And there's technical documentation as well. So, but yeah, I haven't dived into the technical stuff myself just yet. All right, that's it from the sheet. I think there's going to be more there's more in the AMA series channel here. So I'm going to go through these quickly and then we'll finish up, as this has gone for a long time now. So one here from Con Limani. Sorry, I know I've gotten that wrong. If we get to an ultimate boss endgame of stablecoins being regulated as securities and ETH other mainstream coins being taxed with wash rules, etc., that to me is ultimate win. That is why crypto is going up with the new bills going through Congress on the same. It means that it's not going to be outlawed. Agree. I think that there is some kind of like merit to people saying like regulations are bullish, because what regulations do, especially for institutions and other kind of players like that, they they de-risk the industry for these players, and it brings a lot more clarity for people as well. So you go from there being like a new regulation FUD every week, but saying, oh, the SEC is going to ban stablecoins, oh, this thing's going to be a security too. Okay, well, the SEC has said that this stablecoin is a security, or this one isn't. They've given a definitive answer here, so that uncertainty kind of like disappears from the ecosystem, which is bullish. So yeah, I definitely agree that the more clarity we get on the regulation side, the better it is. But at the end of the day, if the regulation is bad, it's still going to be a net negative, and people are still going to leave the wherever that kind of regulation happens and go somewhere else and still do their thing. So yeah. All right, one here from Hillbilly Chess who says, do you think having an improved Gini coefficient for ETH would be helpful for growth? How do you think about that ratio and sustainability of a project long term? I think I've talked about the distribution of ETH enough already on the AMA, so Hillbilly, you can go back and kind of like see my answers for that sort of stuff. And I just gave one actually. But I guess like the Gini coefficient should improve over time for ETH, especially as we go through different market cycles and stuff like that. I'm not sure how much it's going to improve from here. There's definitely a lot of people who are going to hoard their ETH forever. I mean, I am personally going to hoard my ETH forever. I said multiple times that I never plan to sell my ETH. And I think that's just what the asset is. Like, it's definitely going to lend itself to that. But at the end of the day, there's still going to be a new ETH being issued, as I mentioned just before. So I think, yeah, I don't think it's going to be an issue, but we're going to have to see how it plays out. And I'm going to see how the Gini coefficient trends over time. So one here from Crypto Bunker. Could you speak on owning ETH tokens versus owning all ETH? I recently converted everything to ETH and would like some motivation and thesis behind it so I can stick with that allocation. Also, what are the chances the OpenSea moves fully to layer 2? I can't really give you an answer to the first question. In terms of like what you should kind of like do with your money, I can't give investment advice there. But what I can say is that I'm very heavy ETH. I don't really have any other tokens out there. I think in an EIP 1559 world, it's going to be very, very hard for other tokens on ETH, especially the ones that are already worth billions of dollars, to outperform ETH over the long term. In saying that, there are other things that you can probably not buy, I guess, but like there are other kind of like things that that you can kind of, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for here? The other kind of things you can speculate on that are much more risky than ETH because they kind of like earlier on in their life cycle as a project, they're much more volatile, but the potential for outperforming ETH is there for sure. But that's, it's very, very hard, and I can't tell you which ones are going to perform well and which ones aren't. I definitely have some kind of like bets that I've made personally. They're all pretty public, and I disclose them all the time. But generally, yeah, it's very, in my mind, it's going to be very hard over the long term to outperform ETH for a lot of these tokens. And what are the chances the OpenSea moves fully to layer 2? Well, they're already on the Polygon POS chain, which obviously technically isn't a layer 2, but if you're looking for a more scalable OpenSea, it's on there, and you can bring your NFTs from there to layer 1 Ethereum. And they've already committed to building on Immutable X, which is an NFT-focused ZK rollup, or not technically a ZK rollup, I should say, Validium. So yeah, I don't know when that's coming. Should be soon, hopefully, but yeah. Professor Rhino, this might be a very redundant question, but how do I position myself to get airdrops? I feel like I'm clearly doing something very wrong as I keep missing out. The best way to position yourself for airdrops, my friend, is go check out the airdrop hunting channel in the Discord. We kind of like created this channel the other day, and there's been a lot of people sharing alpha in there. So definitely go check that out. Ask your questions in there. Follow along with what people are sharing. That is your best source of alpha, I think, for airdrops right now. All right, one here from Lloyd Banksy who says, can you please talk a little bit about the kinds of perks, benefits that you have seen for social clubs built around tokens or NFTs, such as Friends with Benefits or CryptoPunks? I think the benefits, it depends. It depends on what you consider a benefit. For something like CryptoPunk, the benefit is that you get a bit of like social cred, right? And a bit of like social reputation. You get a really cool profile picture that you can set for yourself, that you can basically signal to everyone, hey, like I own a CryptoPunk, and and this looks like me, and you kind of get some social cred out of that. In terms of like the social clubs thing, I think when you join these sorts of things, that it's like any social club, right? Where you have you can kind of like curate the group of people that you interact with, and you can kind of like, I guess, curate it in such a way where you don't have people that are just like trolling or like full of crap or whatever. You actually have people working towards something in terms of, I guess, like adding value to the ecosystem. But I would also say on that note, when you think about these social tokens, I actually think about them more like DAOs. And if you look at all the DAOs out there, just look at what DAOs are doing in general. Like one of my favorite DAOs right now is the Bankless DAO, because it's like a media DAO. It's very different to what we've seen in the past. But essentially, since they launched the Bank token, the Bankless community has grown so much. They're doing a lot more stuff now. They're doing a lot more products. They're doing merch and things like that. They're trying to grow themselves. So those are kind of like the perks that you have. It's where it's like a coordination mechanism where the token acts as a way of coordinating an awesome community around it, and the community is kind of aligned on increasing the value of that token over time. And then, perks come with owning a part of the token, depending on what club it is, and you can kind of feel part of the community as well. So, and then maybe you get like exclusive access to different things, like maybe you get an airdrop because you held a specific token or something like that at a specific time, and stuff like that. So hopefully that answers your questions there, Lloyd. One here from a Latin girl who says, Arbitrum and Optimism are using ETH to pay gas fees while the L2 using Starkware Tech are gas free. I don't understand how they, DYDX, Diversify, get this gas free. Could you please help to explain? It's not gas free. They're subsidizing it. So the way to think about gas on L2, just one sec. Sorry, I'm going to get a drink. Sorry. So the way to think about gas fees on L2 is that they're split into two different parts. The gas fee is, one part is the L1 fees that every layer 2 has to pay, whether they're a roll-up or a Validium or a Volition, and that's the fee to put the batches on-chain, the data on-chain, the proofs on-chain, all that sort of stuff. That is unavoidable. That is the layer 1 fee that has to be paid no matter what. It has to be paid by someone. The platforms offering free fees there are subsidizing this. And then there's the second part of it, which is the kind of like fee for using the L2 itself. Now, the reason why it's more expensive on Optimism and Arbitrum is because right now they have transaction throughput limits where over time, as those limits go up, the individual costs come down to a certain point, and they're kind of like spread out across like all the people on that system. And the same is true for ZK rollups. But then you have constructions like Validium and Volitions, which are much cheaper than a rollup, because what a Validium does is it basically takes the data off chain and stores it on a off chain data availability committee, where it still posts the proofs to layer 1 Ethereum, which are much cheaper to post than the data. So, but this comes with the trade-off that if the data availability committee, which is basically just a set of nodes, goes offline, you can potentially lose your funds because you don't have the data to withdraw your funds from kind of like layer 1 there. So from that perspective, you just kind of like have a trade-off. And as far as I know, DYDX and Diversify are both, I think they're both ZK rollups right now. I think on the L2Beat website, it says that. I'm just quickly checking it right now. So DYDX is a ZK rollup, and Diversify is a Validium, sorry. So that's why Diversify can do it. But DYDX may just be subsidizing it. The costs are probably quite high for them right now, considering they're a ZK rollup, but maybe they're using kind of like a hybrid approach here. I actually saw someone question the other day, is DYDX really a ZK rollup? And I haven't really dug too deep into that. But if they are, then they're definitely subsidizing a lot of costs right now, because they still have to pay those hefty layer 1 fees to store their data on layer 1. Whereas Diversify is a Validium, so they get away with that. But as I said, there's a trade-off there. So yeah, hopefully that helps you understand that they're Latin girl. All right, one here from Mark_O, and I think this is going to be it for today. So I wanted to ask about your thoughts on the insurance across DeFi. Is this something the average retail DeFi user should be considering, or is this something for protocols that rely on other protocols to seriously consider? Should the rule of thumb be to insure when locking large amounts of collateral, big percentage of a portfolio in a protocol to mitigate smart contract risk? Yes, I think so. If you're locking up large amounts, you should definitely check out insurance on it. But I think that it's on the protocols to embed this directly into their kind of like front ends or to their protocol themselves. You can imagine, for example, going to MakerDAO and Maker having like Oasis, which is like a portal into Maker, and on that portal having like a button or a checkbox that you can click that says, yes, I want insurance on this, and then it says insurance powered by Nexus Mutual or insurance powered by some other insurance protocol, and then it's just built into, I guess, kind of like the transaction, and you pay the premium, and you get cover like that. So yeah, I definitely think that if you're dealing with large amounts of money, you should, especially if you're putting it into maybe newer protocols. But yeah, so hopefully that kind of like answers your question there. And I think that's going to be it for today, because it's been 2.5 hours now. So longest AMA ever, but a lot of good questions. So yeah, unless anyone else has any questions from the audience, I'm going to wrap it up. I'll give it another kind of like 10 seconds, and then I'll wrap it up. All right, doesn't seem like it. Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone for attending the 10th AMA. Another one will happen in 2 weeks, but this AMA has been recorded, so if you came in late, then you can definitely check out the recording on YouTube tomorrow within 24 hours. But I'll catch you all in the Discord channel. Thanks, everyone. See you later.